Chapter 17 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 17. Lord Derrington explains. George was rather puzzled to reconcile the apparent contradiction in Derrington's speech. The old gentleman saw his bewilderment, and before the young man could speak he anticipated his question. "You are perplexed," he said quietly. "I thought you would be. To explain myself clearly, it will be better to tell you the whole story from the beginning." "What story?" "The story of your mother's marriage and of my quarrel with your father. Do not be afraid. I shall say nothing to hurt your pride." George nodded. "I am sure of that. We are friends now." Derrington was much gratified by this speech. But he merely acknowledged it with a grunt and began his family history at once. "Your father and I never got on well," he said frankly, "and I fear it was my fault. I wanted Percy to obey me implicitly, and as he was of an age to judge for himself, he objected. You would have done the like in his case." "I certainly should, sir. Every man should judge for himself." "If he has brains to do so. But I fear Percy was not overburdened with brains. He was gay and thoughtless and thriftless. Your talents, George, come from your mother. She must have been a remarkable woman." "So Mr. Ireland says." "Pooh! He was in love with her, and a man in love is incapable of giving an opinion. However, I saw your mother several times when she sang, although I never met her to speak to. She was very beautiful and had an intellectual face. Yes, George, it is from her that you inherit your brain. From my side of the family you inherit a strong will and a propensity to fight. There is Irish blood in our veins," said Derrington grimly. "Was my father a fighter?" "In a way, yes. But he had not a strong will, save in resisting me." George smiled and said nothing. But he privately thought that if Mr. Percy Vane could hold his own against Derrington, he must have had a stronger will than the old gentleman gave him credit for. "However, to continue," pursued Derrington, pushing away his empty cup. "Percy saw Miss Lockwood. He fell in love with her, and finally he eloped. I wrote him a letter saying he was to return or I would never see him again. He declined to return, and remained on the Continent with his wife. I never did see him again," added Derrington quietly, "for 3 years later he was murdered at San Remo." "In his letter to you did my father say he was married?" "He did. But at the time, as he did not say where the marriage was celebrated, I thought he mentioned it out of obstinacy." George colored. "I don't see why you should have so misjudged my mother," he said hotly. "Admitting that she was not born in the purple, she was in a good position, and had no reason to run away with my father." "She was in love with him, I believe." "Even then she would not have eloped unless it was to be married." Derrington nodded. "You are perfectly right," he said. "I tried to disbelieve in the marriage, but in my own heart I knew there was one. I have behaved very badly, George." "You have, sir. But as we are now reconciled, the less said about the thing the better. You are quite sure you do not know where the marriage was celebrated?" "No, George, I do not. After the death of your father I tried to find out, but it was impossible. Had I really seen the register of the marriage, I should have acknowledged you as my heir. As a matter of fact," added Derrington with a burst of candour, "I did not trouble much to search, as I feared lest the marriage should be verified." George wriggled in his seat. "Let us say no more," he said. "Very good. I have confessed my sins, and have received absolution from you. At the present moment we will leave the murder of your father at San Remo alone, and come to the appearance of Mrs. Jersey in my life. You were with your grandfather Lockwood in Amelia Square. I had constituted my second son my heir, and I had relegated to obscurity the escapade of my son Percy. All was nicely settled, in my humble opinion, when Mrs. Jersey appeared to make trouble. That was 8 years after your father's death." "Where was she in the meantime?" "I cannot say. She told me nothing of her history, but from a word or two which she let slip, I believe she must have been in the United States. Why she went there from San Remo, or for what reason, I cannot say. She came here to see me. We had an interview in this very room, to demand money." "What threat did she make?" "That she would tell where the marriage took place." "And you bribed her to keep silence?" Derrington winced at the scorn in his grandson's voice, and took a turn up and down the room. "I am no saint, I admit," he said. "And at the time, George, I did not know that you would turn out such a fine fellow. I dreaded a scandal, and there was your uncle to be considered. I had made him my heir." "And what about me, sir? Were the sins of my father to be placed on my shoulders?" "I have admitted that I was in the wrong," said Derrington impatiently. "Spare me further sermons." "I beg your pardon," said George quietly. "But please touch as lightly as possible on these matters. We will admit that you acted according to your lights." "False lights," said his grandfather sadly. "However, we need speak no more on that particular point. Mrs. Jersey said that she knew where the marriage was celebrated, adding that if I did not give her an annuity, she would go to Lockwood and help him to prove that you were my legitimate grandson and heir." "Did she say if the marriage was celebrated in England or abroad?" "No, sir. Mrs. Jersey was a remarkably clever woman, and if my son Percy had married her, she would have made a man of him." "Then she really was in love with my father?" "Very deeply in love, as she told me herself. But she did not regard his memory with such veneration as to desire to aid his son. She was content that you should lose your rights, provided that I paid her an annuity. I tried in vain to learn from her where the marriage had been celebrated. She refused to open her mouth, so I allowed her an annuity of $500 a year." "That was a large sum," interposed George. Derrington shrugged his shoulders. "Much larger than I could afford, my good sir," he said. "But Mrs. Jersey dictated her own terms. I arranged that the money should be paid through my lawyers, and she vanished." "Where to?" "I can't say. She might have gone to rejoin Mr. Jersey, if there ever was such a person. She sent a messenger regularly to the office of my lawyers for the money, but did not trouble me in any way. Her next appearance was shortly after the death of your grandfather." "What did she want this time?" "To set up a boarding house in Amelia Square. She said that her life was lonely, a remark which made me think Mr. Jersey was a myth, and that she wanted company. I expect she learned in some way that I was buying old Lockwood's house." "Why did you buy it?" "I have a lot of property in that district, and I wanted to round it off with this house. Ireland, in his rage at me for my treatment of your mother, would not have sold it to me. I bought the house through an agent. Mrs. Jersey must have heard of the purchase, for it was then that she came to me and asked me to set her up in the house as a landlady." "I wonder why she did that," said George thoughtfully. "She was lonely, I understand." George looked at his shoes. "As Eliza Stokes, she lived in that house along with my mother previous to the elopement. I expect she had a kind of affection for it." "Well, whatever her reason was, I did what she asked. She agreed to pay me a rent, and her money was as good as anyone else's. Besides, I felt that as my tenant I could keep her under my own eye. When she was away I never knew but what she might die and part with the secret to someone else, who might come on me for blackmail also. I thought it best Mrs. Jersey should have the house, so she went into it and used the old furniture. I don't deny but what she was a good business woman and made the house pay. At all events, she was never behindhand with her rent. I wonder she paid you any at all." "Oh, she had her annuity, and was afraid of pressing me too hard. I refused to let her the house on a 7 years' lease. She only had it from year to year, and in that way I kept a check on her. She knew if I once lost my temper that I would throw her over and acknowledge you as my heir." "I wish you had done so," said Brendan moodily. "It would have saved a lot of trouble." "I do so now," replied Derrington testily. "Better late than never. Well, Mrs. Jersey lived and flourished for 15 years. I tried to find you out, George, lest she should get at you." "Oh, was that why you offered to make me an allowance?" "It was. I intended to give you a yearly income on condition that you went to Australia. Then I could be sure that Mrs. Jersey would not seek you out. But you refused my offer and disappeared." "I went to college under the name of Brendan," observed George. "And that is why Mrs. Jersey never found you, and why I could not come across you until you put those advertisements about the marriage into the papers. It was that which—" "Yes, so Bodsey told me. You had me watched." "I did," said Derrington, "and in that way I found out that you were going to stop in Mrs. Jersey's house." "How did you learn that, sir?" asked George in surprise. "I never told anyone." "Oh, yes. You told Lola." "So I did," said Brendan quickly. "She bothered me to come and see her, and I said that I was going to stop in the neighbourhood of Amelia Square with a friend, and would call on her the next day. I expect she told this to Bodsey." "Exactly, and Bodsey told me. I was afraid lest you should make Mrs. Jersey confess. I wrote to her and asked her to see me. She refused to come to my house, so I made up my mind to seek her out in Amelia Square. I arranged by letter with her to call about 11 o'clock at her place and see her secretly." "Why secretly? And why at night?" "Can't you see, George? My height and figure make me so conspicuous that I knew I would be recognized if I went in the daytime, and then people would ask themselves why Lord Derrington went to see a lodging-house keeper." "You could have put it down to her being a tenant." "Ah," said Derrington grimly, "I never thought of that. I received a note from Mrs. Jersey saying she would wait for me on Friday evening at 11 o'clock in her sitting-room. It was a foggy night, if you remember." "Very foggy. I suppose you traced the house by means of the red light over the door?" "I did not trace the house at all," said Derrington quietly. "I did not go near the house." "But I saw you," insisted George. "You saw my coat and a man with my tall figure, and having my association with yourself in your head, you jumped to the conclusion that the figure was me." "Then if not you, who was the man?" "Bodsey," said Derrington curtly. George stared. "In your coat?" he said incredulously. "It seems strange," said Derrington, "but the fact is that Bodsey is one of the few who have got the better of me in my life. It was in this way that he prevented me from seeing Mrs. Jersey. On that night I visited him at his rooms, which then were in Bloomsbury. I desired to tell him that I intended to see Mrs. Jersey, and to warn her against revealing anything. I don't suppose the warning was needed, as she knew when she was well off. But the fact is, Mrs. Jersey was not in good health, and was feeling compunction about keeping you out of your rights. I learned from Bodsey that Mrs. Jersey had written out a confession of the whole matter, and that she intended to leave this to her niece Marjorie Watson, so that I might be forced to continue the lease of the house." George uttered an ejaculation. "I thought from what Marjorie said that there was some such confession," he remarked. "But it is missing. It was not found among her papers after her death. Unless Miss Bull took it and forced you to—" "No," interrupted Derrington vigorously. "She came here quietly and put the case of the poor girl to me. She also undertook that the rent would be paid regularly, and that through Miss Watson she would manage the house. I was quite satisfied with the existing arrangements, and, moreover, thought that if such a confession were found, out of gratitude Miss Watson might bring it to me. If Miss Bull had told her to, she would have done so, but not otherwise," said George. "She is under Miss Bull's thumb." "The best place she could be, George. The girl is a born idiot from what I saw of her. However, you know why I renewed the year-by-year lease. Where the confession is, I have no idea. But the person who holds it will certainly make use of it some day to extort money, and then we will learn who killed Mrs. Jersey. I dare say. The assassin must have taken the papers. Well?" Derrington proceeded with his account of his doings on that night. "As I said, I went to see Bodsey at his rooms. I took a cab, and as the fog was thick I had considerable difficulty in finding the place. The rain and fog chilled me, for I am not so young as I was, and when I arrived I was shivering. But I was too anxious to tell Bodsey about Mrs. Jersey to trouble. He heated some water to give me a glass of hot whiskey. While the water was boiling I told him I was going to see Mrs. Jersey. He asked me how I could get into the house without being admitted by one of the servants, and thus run a chance of my visit being known. Did it never strike him that Mrs. Jersey expected you and would admit you when you rang?" "Yes, it did strike him. But he knew that I didn't want any one to know that she had a visitor so late at night." "I don't know why you took all these precautions, sir." Derrington smiled dryly. "Perhaps they were rather unnecessary, but I thought it best to be on the safe side. As a matter of fact, I had a latchkey." "I thought that Mrs. Jersey never allowed latchkeys." "This one came to me when I bought the house, and was given to me by the agent. I told Mrs. Jersey I had it, and that I would let myself in. She expected me at 11. "I know she did," said George, "for on that night she asked the boarders to be in bed by 11, and broke up her party at 10. I wondered if she was having any one to meet her then." "She was expecting me. It was after 10 when I told Bodsey, and I explained to him that I had a latchkey. He gave me the whiskey, and being chilled I drank it. Then I fell asleep." George looked up suddenly. "The whiskey was drugged," he guessed. "It was," assented Derrington, "and while I was insensible, Bodsey took the latchkey out of my pocket and put on my coat. He is rather my height, so with that and the fur coat I expect he passed himself off as me to Mrs. Jersey until she saw his face." "When she did, she would have nothing to do with him. Although," added George, "he was an old boarder in the house." "Wait till I tell you the rest," said Derrington, "and then you can give an opinion. When I woke it was after 12. I never suspected that the whiskey had been drugged, and thought that it was some sort of illness. Bodsey was in the room when I awoke. He did not tell me that he had been to Mrs. Jersey, and I now saw that it was too late to go. He advised me to see her on the morrow, saying that it was doubtful if you would speak to her on that night. I intended to wait till the next day, but as a matter of fact I became anxious to see if any one was with her, and I went down the stairs." "By means of that secret door? Bodsey told me." "Well, I crept downstairs and saw, as I thought, you. It was, of course, Bodsey. He was standing at the door of the sitting room. I was afraid lest you, as I thought it was, should see me, so I went upstairs again." "And Bodsey left the house. However, I never suspected him. I went home and found Mrs. Ward waiting for me. She came to tell me that she had heard from Dorothy that you purposed to stop with train at Mrs. Jersey's house, and came to warn me." "How good of Mrs. Ward!" "She is a dangerous woman, George. I threw my coat on yonder sofa, and she sat near it. Feeling something in the pocket, her curiosity led her to take out something when I was absent from the room. It was a stiletto." George started from his seat. "A stiletto?" "Yes." Derrington opened the drawer in his desk, and took out the weapon which Mrs. Ward had brought. This was between the fur and the lining of the coat. What with the weight of the coat, and the position of this weapon lying along the bottom of the coat, I never suspected it. I brought it home quite unconsciously. Mrs. Ward found it, took it away with her, and came the other day to accuse me of having murdered Mrs. Jersey. How dare she do such a thing? Oh, Mrs. Ward is capable of all things. However, you can see from what I tell you what happened. Bodsey put the stiletto in my coat, and either forgot to take it out or left it there so that I might be incriminated. Did he tell you this? He told me, when I rebuked him too sharply, that he could get me into trouble, and explained how he had been in the house. He also referred to the stiletto. I denied that I had seen it, and it was only when Mrs. Ward brought it the other day that I saw that this part of Bodsey's story was true. What did you do? I accused him of having killed the woman. What did he say? He denied that he had done so. He declared that he went to Mrs. Jersey's sitting-room door, close upon 12, having let himself in noiselessly by the front door. He discovered Mrs. Jersey lying dead, as she was found in the morning. On the floor was the stiletto. Fearing lest he should be accused of the crime, Bodsey left the house quickly, but took the stiletto with him so that he might find out who had done the deed. He changed his mind, or left it by mistake in my fur coat. Did he ask for money? No, he has not done so yet. But he told me very plainly that no one could prove that he had been in the house on that night, and that if he had been seen, the coat would make people think it was I. Exactly what I did think, said George. Well, I had to hold my tongue, for you see I was in a most awkward position, and I could prove nothing. I bluffed Mrs. Ward, but if the matter came into court, things would look extremely unpleasant for me. I can see that, said Brendan, but Bodsey? He has made himself secure, as no one can prove that he was in the house on that night. Even you thought it was I. I can't say for certain if Bodsey committed the murder, or if he really did find the woman dead as he said, but he swears to his innocence. As yet he has not made any use of his power, but I am quite sure that he will try and get money out of me, so I have asked you here to advise me about the matter. Do you think Bodsey has the confession? He may have. If so, he knows where the marriage was celebrated. Brendan mused for a time. I think it best to do nothing at the present moment, he said. Bodsey is friendly to me, as I saved him from being run over. If he thought I knew this, he might turn crusty, and make trouble. Better wait. For what? Asked Derrington restlessly. To see what he will do. If he does blackmail you, call me in. Derrington drew a long breath. Yes, I think you are right, he said. We will wait. But I don't trust that man. He's a scoundrel, said George, but I know how to conquer him. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 18. Miss Bull's Story. Miss Bull was alone in the sitting-room of the late Mrs. Jersey. Marjorie had gone out shopping, and the old maid, left to her own resources, amused herself as usual with playing patience. With the exception of a few old ladies in the drawing-room, the house was empty, and Miss Bull found the quiet very soothing. After a time she grew weary of the game, and seated herself in an armchair to meditate. Her thoughts were sad. Here she was, an old spinster, dragging out her miserable old age in a London lodging-house, while her sister lived and fared sumptuously in accordance with her position. Miss Bull looked back on all the trials she had passed through, and wondered how she had been able to stand them. For a moment a revolt took place in her breast at the cruel fate she had endured, but the feeling died away, and she relapsed into the patient misery which was her usual frame of mind. "It can't last much longer," said Miss Bull with a sigh. "I am getting old, and the end is coming. The sooner the better." As she gave vent to this dreary sentence there was a ring at the door. Miss Bull paid little attention to it, as she never had any visitors. But this day proved to be an exception, for George was admitted into the room. He advanced cordially toward Miss Bull. "I have come to see you again, you see," said Brendan. Miss Bull gave him her hand with a great deal of pleasure, and invited him to be seated. Now that she had thawed towards George, she treated him kindly, and her face wore a less stony look. As the sun melts the frost, so did the reserved nature of the old maid melt when in the sunshine of Brendan's presence. More than that, Miss Bull actually congratulated herself on Marjory's absence, as it gave her a chance of having the company of George all to herself. "I am very glad to see you, Mr. Brendan," she said, ringing the bell. "You will have some tea?" "Thank you," replied Brendan, who thought she might thaw still more under the influence of the tea urn. "I suppose you wonder why I have come again so soon." Miss Bull smiled in her calm way. "You have come to make further inquiries likely to forward your fight for your birthright." George laughed. "There's no need for that, thank God," said he. "My grandfather has agreed to acknowledge me." "Then there was a marriage?" "I cannot be certain of that yet. How do you know about that?" Miss Bull answered quietly. "You told me last time you were here that you were Lord Derrington's grandson, and I heard that there was some doubt about the legitimacy." "I know it was common talk at one time," replied Brendan, satisfied with this explanation. "Did Mrs. Jersey ever speak about it?" "No, she never did. What did she know about it?" "I think you can best answer that question, Miss Bull." George looked hard at her, and a faint tinge of color crept into her face. Before she could reply with a counter question, the servant brought in the tea. Miss Bull waited to supply George with a cup before she spoke. By that time the servant had left the room, and the door, as Miss Bull assured herself, was closed. "I don't know what you allude to, Mr. Brendan." "Perhaps if I allude to your life in San Remo you—" Miss Bull started to her feet, and the cup she held fell on the carpet. "San Remo," she muttered. "Yes, Miss Howard," said Brendan, using her real name purposely. The little old maid put one thin hand to her head. "Miss Howard?" "The daughter of the late General Howard," said George. "My father was a general. He was General Howard. You are Miss Jenny Howard." Miss Bull started, and then sat down. Her face expressed pain. "He used to call me Jenny. Jenny Howard. Yes, there was a happy girl of that name, but she died." "Not at all," said Brendan briskly, to arouse her from this dreamy state. "She lived and changed her name to Bull." The woman pushed back her white hair and made an effort to be calm. But her lip quivered. "Why have you come here to awaken these painful memories?" she asked. "Because I wish to know how my father came by his death." "I do not know. Indeed, I do not know," moaned Miss Bull, putting out her hand as though to ward off the thought. "You may not know for certain, but you have some idea. Your sister, Mrs. Ward—" Miss Bull's face flushed crimson, and she drew a deep breath. "Oh, it's Violet's work, is it?" she said, and her eyes grew hard. "And pray, Mr. Brendan, has she sent you to cross-question me?" "No. I come on my own behalf. You knew my father?" "Percy Vane. Yes, I knew him. He loved me. Ah, indeed he did. That night he asked me to be his wife, and had he not been murdered—" "Did he ask you when he was taking you home?" asked George, wondering how Miss Bull would have behaved as his stepmother. "Taking me home? He never did that on the night of the ball." "Your sister, Mrs. Ward—" "I have no sister. I disown Violet. She is a wicked woman." George was quite of this opinion, yet for the sake of Dorothy he dissented. "She has her good points, Miss Bull." "No, no, she has no good points. She is selfish, vain, cruel, and deceitful, a child of the devil. How do you know that I am her sister, and how did you come to learn my name?" "Lord Derrington told me, and it was told to him by Mr. Ireland." "Your guardian." Miss Bull tapped her hand on the woodwork of her chair. "He recognized me when I called to see him on that day about the lease. But he promised to hold his tongue. He would have done so had he not been startled by meeting Mrs. Ward and recognizing in her the woman who had left the ball with my father. And Violet admitted this. No, she said that you had left the ball with my father. It was you who wore the blue domino and the holly sprig." "Liar, liar!" muttered Miss Bull. "But she is always the same. When I saw her at the music hall the other night, her face wore the same false smile. Oh, that I could see her punished as she deserves!" "God will punish her, Miss Bull." "He has delayed long," said the old maid with a bitter smile. "My sister has enjoyed the good things of this life. She has had money, position, praise, and all that a woman desires. As for myself—" She looked around the room and burst into a bitter laugh. "Yet Jenny Howard was always considered the prettier sister of the two." "Then it really was Mrs. Ward who left the ball?" "It was. She lays the blame on my shoulders." Miss Bull paused, and her mouth worked nervously. "Does she accuse me of the crime?" "No. She says that you left Mr. Vane at the gate of the hotel." "Oh," muttered Miss Bull. "Percy came as far as that with her, did he? And she said he left her at the door of the room where the ball was being held? Liar, liar! She always was. She always will be. Can the leopard change his spots?" By this time the ice in Miss Bull's nature had melted under the heat of her indignation. She walked hurriedly up and down the room, her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed. George was pleased to see this, as he thought she was the more likely to tell the truth when thus moved by emotion than if she had remained calm. Miss Bull was so angered by the memory of her wrongs that she struck her hand against the mantelpiece so as to inflict pain. The shock seemed to nerve her, for she drew a long breath and returned to her seat. With her eyes fixed on George, she began abruptly. "Violet has told her story," she said. "Now I will tell you mine. I want to know, however, exactly what she said, in the exact words, if you can remember them." "I did not hear her speak," confessed George. "It was my grandfather and Mr. Ireland to whom she told the story." "Story, fable, lie, romance," said Miss Bull vehemently. "Well, tell me what you can remember." This George did as concisely as possible, for he feared lest Marjory should interrupt the interview. Miss Bull listened with a downcast face and pursed up lips. Not a word did she say, but when George ended she looked up with a bitter smile. "She has simply put herself in my place," she said. "Wait." For a moment or so she tried to compose herself. Then she raised her head and looked her visitor squarely in the eyes. "I am going to tell the truth," said Miss Bull bravely. "Therefore I have no need to shun your gaze. Mr. Brendan, I loved your father." "So Mrs. Ward said." "And Violet loved him also." "He must have been a singularly attractive man," remarked Brendan, wondering at this revelation. "My mother eloped with him, her maid was in love with him, and now you and Mrs. Ward—" "Oh, Violet really did not love him. It was simply a desire to take him from me that made her behave as she did. Violet never loved any one in her life, save the person she sees in the mirror every day. A selfish woman, Mr. Brendan, and a wicked one." This was no news to George, so he strove to coax her to tell him that which he wished to know. "I don't quite understand, but if you will relate the story—" "I shall do so at once. You may as well know all, and know also what a bad woman I have for a sister. If she was dying," cried Miss Bull vehemently, "I wouldn't raise a finger to save her life." "We should forgive our enemies," hinted George. "I can't forgive her. I never will forgive her. She ruined my life, George Brendan. She ruined my life." Brendan said nothing, and in a few moments Miss Bull composed herself sufficiently to tell what she knew. "My father was General Howard," she said quietly, "and Violet was my only sister. We never got on well together. Violet was jealous of admiration, and as I was said to be prettier than she was, she hated me intensely. Whenever anyone liked me, Violet would do her best to take him away from me." "I can quite believe that," said George, recalling Mrs. Ward's arts. "She did not always succeed, however," continued Miss Bull with a flush. "I had my admirers also, and some I could keep. But when Violet could manage it, she always took them away." "You hinted that she took my father away," said Brendan. "She did. At least, she tried to. But if he had not been murdered, I should have been Mrs. Vane, in spite of Violet's arts." "Well, tell me how you came to San Remo and met my father." "Oh, I knew him before that. We were 6 months at Como and saw your father frequently then. He and the General used to talk politics. Mr. Vane was always bringing us books and magazines, and we used to climb Mount Bisbino. What a delightful summer that was! I remember you then," she added, looking at George with interest. "You were scarcely 2 years old. A dear, good, fair little fellow. I met you and the nurse sometimes, and often carried you." "Was the nurse's name Eliza Stokes?" "No, it was, let me see, some Scotch name. Jane Fraser, I think." "Ah, then Eliza Stokes was not at Como." "I never saw her. Mr. Vane told me that you had had another nurse, but that he had to dismiss her at Milan for impertinence." George saw that Miss Bull was not keeping strictly to the truth, and corrected her at once. "You knew Eliza Stokes at San Remo?" "So I did. I quite forgot." Miss Bull put her hand to her head with a puzzled air. "But since my illness I have forgotten so much. It is all a blank to me. Tell me, Mr. Brendan, have you ever felt as though you were a ghost?" "No," replied George, keeping his countenance with difficulty. "I don't think I have ever experienced that feeling." Miss Bull looked vaguely at the window. "It is a strange feeling," after which remark she lapsed into silence, still staring. Brendan remembered that she had been in an asylum, and thought that her mind was still weak. It might be that after all she had not told an untruth, but had quite forgotten Eliza Stokes. George was confirmed in his supposition by her next remark. "Eliza Stokes. I remember. Mrs. Jersey." "You knew she was Mrs. Jersey?" "Yes. That was why I came to this house." "Did you like her then?" Miss Bull's eyes flashed. "She was another Violet. I hated her. Oh, how I hated her! I found her through my sister mentioning that Lord Derrington had given her this house, so I came here to board." "But your sister knows nothing about you. She says you ran away, and that it was supposed you were dead." Miss Bull laughed bitterly. "My sister knows perfectly well that I live here, but it suits her to disown the relationship. It is my wish also, and for that reason I changed my name. No one would recognize pretty Jenny Howard in poor Miss Bull." She paused for a moment, and then continued. "Yes, I knew that Eliza Stokes had become Mrs. Jersey, and that is why I came here." "But if you hated her—" I did, but she was the only person who could talk about Mr. Vane. She loved him also, but not as I did, and we have talked for hours in this very room. We quarreled, certainly, but at times she was very nice. I miss our talks greatly." It really seemed as though Miss Bull was weak in the head. She admitted to hating Mrs. Jersey, and yet she came to stop with her. It might be that Mrs. Jersey looked after her as a kind of keeper, and that she acted the tyrant. At that moment, as though answering his thought, Miss Bull made a sudden observation. "Mrs. Jersey knew that I had been in an asylum. She would have sent me back if she could, the vile woman. But I was never afraid of her, never. And she always talked to me of Mr. Vane," concluded Miss Bull in a softer tone. "Did she know who killed him?" Miss Bull shook her head. "No, she never knew. No one ever knew. I sometimes thought that Violet, but she declared that he left her at the door of the ballroom." "Miss Bull," said George, growing impatient of this disconnected recital, "will you go on with your story?" "Story? Yes, it is a story, a sad romance." She passed her hand again over her forehead as though wearied, and resumed with an effort. "Mr. Vane left Como and came to Milan. Afterward he went on to San Remo. My father, who liked his society, joined him there. We stopped at the Hotel d'Angleterre. Eliza Stokes was a housemaid there, and it was while attending to our bedroom that she told me she had been your nurse. She was a large, stout girl with red cheeks. As Mrs. Jersey she was vastly improved, but as a girl—" Miss Bull shuddered in a prim way, and continued, "Yet she had her admirers. A waiter called George Rates wished to marry her. She had accepted him, but while within sight of Mr. Vane she could not love him." "How do you mean?" "Well, Eliza used to spy on Mr. Vane and follow him in his walks. She was quite insane about him. I told Mr. Vane, and he kept away from the hotel. And George Rates was jealous of Eliza's love for Mr. Vane. But he never loved her, nor Violet. He loved no one but me." "And he told you so at the masked ball?" "Yes. There was to be a masked ball, and both Violet and I were anxious to go. We made a friend of Eliza, and she got us 2 blue dominoes. That we might recognize one another, we each wore a sprig of yellow holly. My father was supposed to know nothing about the matter, but we told a young Oxford cousin of ours. He met us at the ball, and afterward took Violet away. I found Mr. Vane, and we danced together. He did not know me at first, but afterward, when we went into a quiet room, I unmasked. He was vexed at first that I and Violet should come to the ball unattended, as he said my father would be so angry, which was quite true. Then he told me that he loved me, and asked me to become his wife. I accepted, and he kissed me." Miss Bull paused, moved by an emotion too deep for words. "I was fond of you as a baby, George, and he, your father, knew I would be a good mother to you." "Did he speak of his first wife, of my mother?" "Yes. He told me how dearly he had loved her." "Did he say where the marriage was celebrated?" "No. I never thought to ask him. I always thought there was a marriage. Why should I not? Until I later heard that Lord Derrington denied that such had taken place. But that was after I came out of the asylum," added Miss Bull with a troubled air. "So it might be my fancy." "No, it is true. Lord Derrington did deny the marriage. But he now recognizes that it took place. We wish to find where." "I cannot help you, Mr. Brendan. Mr. Vane never mentioned it to me. He told me that he loved me. Then he went away to get me Annise, and said he would take me home, and return for Violet. I waited, but as he did not appear I went to look for him. He was gone." "With your sister?" "Yes," said Miss Bull, clenching her fists. "Violet overheard a part of our conversation. She had just come down from the box of the Marchesa Beltrami." "That was where she unmasked and Mr. Ireland recognized her." "She must have seen me with Mr. Vane," continued Miss Bull, taking no notice of this interruption. "So she stole behind us, and heard what we were to one another. Then she slipped on her mask and followed Mr. Vane. She said she did not want Annise, but that she desired to go home at once. Mr. Vane wanted to wait for her." "For Violet?" "Yes. He thought that I had run after him, and as Violet wore a blue domino with the sprig of holly, he fancied she was me." "I understand. So he took her home?" "She said he left her at the door, and then came back to look for Violet," said Miss Bull contemptuously. "She disguised her voice, and he quite thought she was myself. But from what Mr. Ireland said, Mr. Vane saw Violet home to the gates of the hotel. I waited for a time, and as your father did not come back I ran home alone. Violet was in our bedroom, and said that Mr. Vane had left her at the door of the ballroom and had gone back for me. Then the next morning we heard of the murder. I never knew, until you told me, how Violet had managed to get Mr. Vane away from me." "She tricked you," said George sympathizingly. "She tricked everyone. When I heard of your father's death I felt very ill. The world became a blank to me. When I came to myself I was in an asylum. Then I grew better and was let out. My father died, and an annuity was allowed to me. I heard about Mrs. Jersey taking this house, and wishing for someone to talk to about your father, I came here, and here I have been ever since. A lonely woman, Mr. Brendan, but I find Marjorie a great comfort." "Then you do not know who killed my father?" "No." Miss Bull shook her head. "He was struck down on the parade when returning to the ballroom. It must have been after he saw my sister home." "Do you think Mrs. Ward knows the truth?" "She might. Perhaps someone followed, and Violet might have been mistaken for some person. I know there was a married woman in San Remo deeply in love with Mr. Vane." "What an attractive man he must have been!" "Oh, he was the handsomest man in the world," cried Miss Bull, with genuine enthusiasm, "and so kind. No wonder Eliza Stokes loved him. But he loved no one but me. No one but me." "What did Eliza Stokes say when she heard of his death?" "Oh, she almost went out of her mind. I did altogether," said poor Miss Bull with a wan smile. "And as they found her a nuisance in the hotel she went away. George Rates went also." "Did she marry him?" "No. I asked her when I met her here as Mrs. Jersey. She said that she returned to England, and that Rates had been run over and killed in the street. She then went to America and married Mr. Jersey. He died and left her some money. Then she set up this house." "So she said nothing of the annuity from Lord Derrington?" "No. It wasn't to her interest to do so. She could hold her tongue when she liked. We very often quarreled, but on the whole we were as good friends as two women well could be who had loved the same man." George rose to go. "Thank you for telling me so much, Miss Bull," he said. "What was the name of the woman who loved my father?" "Oh, she was a common woman who kept a shop. Velez was the name." "Velez!" cried George, and added to himself, "So that is how Lola knows." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 19. The Inquiry Agent. As George stepped out of the front door he came face to face with Botsey, who was mounting the steps. The man seemed excited, and carried a carelessly folded newspaper which he had apparently been reading. He did not seem pleased to meet Brendan, and looked at him in a suspicious manner. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said with a certain degree of roughness. "I did not know that this house was interdicted to me," replied Brendan sharply. He liked neither the tone nor the peremptory manner of Botsey, and moreover was not prepossessed in his favour by the report which Lord Derrington had made of the man's duplicity. "I am glad to meet you, however," continued George, "as I wish to have a few words." "I am too busy to give you any time," retorted Botsey, and tried to enter the house. "Nevertheless you will give me a quarter of an hour," said George, blocking the doorway with his stalwart form. What I have to say cannot be left until a more convenient period." "I tell you I am busy, Mr. Brendan." "And I tell you that I intend to have this interview," rejoined Brendan imperiously. "You talk a great deal about gratitude, Bodsey, yet you are unwilling to put yourself out for me in the least degree." Bodsey became penitent at once. "It is true, Mr. Brendan, but I am very worried." He cast a glance at the newspaper in his hand. "However, you have first call upon my time, so we will go to my room." "That's as it should be." No more words passed. Bodsey mounted the stairs and led George into the well-remembered room. Brendan took a chair, and Bodsey, with an anxious look, threw himself into another. The man's face was flushed, his red hair was in disorder, and his eyes were bright. As a rule he was calm and self-controlled, so George conjectured that something particularly important must have occurred to upset him. However, Bodsey's troubles were none of his business, and he began talking at once of his reason for seeking the interview. "I had a conversation with Lord Derrington the other evening," he said deliberately, "and we talked of you." "Then you heard no good of me," replied Bodsey with a sneer. "Lord Derrington does not like me." "That matters little. No liking can exist between a man in Lord Derrington's position and his paid servant." "Oh, you call me that, do you, sir?" "What else are you? Lord Derrington engaged you as his agent to watch me, and that you have done." "Not lately. I have given you a free hand." "In any case I have a free hand," said George loftily. "You were grateful enough for my service in saving your life to release me from your espionage, but had you not done so I should have taken means to put a stop to your dogging my footsteps." "You would not have known had I not told you, Mr. Brendan." "Oh yes, I should. In any case, I should have seen my grandfather, and he would have told me." "No, sir. He is your enemy." "That is where you are wrong, Bodsey. He is my friend." The detective looked astonished. "Do you mean to say that Lord Derrington has climbed down?" he demanded incredulously. "It is strange, is it not?" said George in a bantering tone. "But, as a matter of fact, after a long conversation, Lord Derrington and myself came to understand one another. He intends to recognize me as his heir." "Has he then learnt where the marriage took place?" asked Bodsey, starting from his seat, and again glancing anxiously at the newspaper which lay on a small table at his elbow. "No, we have yet to find that out. But he is quite satisfied, from the hints of the late Mrs. Jersey, that a marriage did take place, and he wishes to make amends to me for his unjust conduct as regards my mother's memory and myself." "Whew! What means did you take to force him to recognize you?" "I used no force at all," responded Brendan very dryly. "Lord Derrington would not climb down unless he were made to." "As a matter of fact, he did. The olive branch was held out by him. All this is none of your business, Mr. Bodsey, and I only tell it to you to clear the ground for what I am about to say." "It's something disagreeable, I bet," said Bodsey, scanning the set face of his visitor. "Your penetration does you credit, sir. It is disagreeable." Bodsey settled himself comfortably in his chair. "Then the sooner we grasp the nettle the sooner will the pain be over," he said, with quite an Eastern wealth of parable. "But first, Mr. Brendan, I should like to know your exact position." "Oh, that is easily explained, and there is no reason why you should not know what all London will know soon. Lord Derrington will join with me in searching for the register of marriage, and meanwhile will recognize me as his grandson and the heir to his estates." "Not a very large income for a future peer," murmured Bodsey. George took no notice of this. "In a fortnight I leave my Kensington rooms and take up my residence with Lord Derrington in St. Giles Square. Then I shall assume my real name of George Vane." "And you will marry Miss Ward, I suppose?" "That is entirely my business," said George placidly. "You will gain nothing by insolence, Bodsey." The man rose with a wounded air. "Upon my word, Mr. Vane," he said, giving George his correct name to show that he recognized his new position, "I have not the slightest intention of being insolent. I am glad for your sake that things are as they are, and pleased for my own, since Lola may now give up thoughts of you and turn to me." "That's all very well, Botsey," said Brendan quietly. "You profess a great friendship for me, but how can I trust you?" "I have never deceived you yet." "I have not given you the chance of doing so. But if the opportunity offered, and it was convenient to you, I am quite sure you would sell me, as the saying goes, to the highest bidder." "Why should you doubt me?" asked Botsey, still wounded. "I can only judge the future by the past, and since you are quite ready to play Lord Derrington false—" "Who says that?" cried the man, sitting down but looking defiant. "I say so. Lord Derrington has told me all." "All what?" demanded Botsey, wilfully ignorant. "All that took place on the night when you came to this house to impersonate him." Botsey laughed, and his face cleared. "If that is your disagreeable business, sir, I can easily put that to rights." "Can you explain why you drugged him, why you threatened him?" "I did not threaten him." "Lord Derrington informed me that you threatened to get him into trouble. That was why he consulted me, and that is why I have come to tell you that if you fight Lord Derrington you will fight me also. Lord Derrington is old, but I am young, and I am quite equal to dealing with you." "I never denied that," said Botsey calmly. "I quite recognize that you are a strong man, Mr. Vane, although it is not to my interest to admit as much." "That's your business," rejoined George coolly. "I play with all my cards on the table. What those are which you have concealed I do not know, but I am quite prepared to play the game. And at the present moment you need not call me by my father's name. I have not yet assumed my position. When I do, George Vane will have nothing to do with you." "But George Brendan has," said Botsey, with a flash of his eyes. "Don't press too hard, Mr. Brendan. I am willing to do you a service, and you are misjudging me." "I am sorry you should think so. Let us cease this bickering. I am willing to hear what you have to say." "If you are satisfied with my explanation, will you endeavour to get Lola to marry me?" "That has nothing to do with me." "But you have influence with her." "It shall not be used to make her miserable. I know nothing about you save what my grandfather told me, and his report does not bias me in your favour. For all I know you might make poor Lola the worst husband in the world." Botsey shrugged his shoulders. "Lola is well able to look after herself," he said. "I think I mentioned that before. But if you are satisfied with what I am about to tell you, will you help me?" "I'll do my best," said George impatiently. "Lola is sure to lose this engagement sooner or later through her vile temper. I do not want to see her on the streets again, and she may as well be supported by you in a respectable manner as by anyone else. Besides, as you truly say, she can take care of her own skin. But I shall not advise her to marry you unless you prove to me that you did not intend to blackmail Lord Derrington." "Nothing was further from my thoughts," said Botsey earnestly. "It was to my interest that your grandfather should hold his tongue about my having been to this house." "He would not have known had you not told him voluntarily." "Oh, yes, he would have discovered in some way. I thought it best to be on the right side by confessing voluntarily what I had done. I said I could get him into trouble, and I admit that I did threaten him so far, simply to make him hold his tongue." "You were afraid lest you should be accused of the crime?" Botsey looked at George in surprise. "That possibility never crossed my mind," he replied calmly. "I certainly did not kill the woman. Do you think I did, Mr. Brendan?" George shrugged his shoulders. "Going by circumstantial evidence." "Oh!" Botsey flipped away that objection with a snap of his fingers. "That's all right. I will explain. No, Mr. Brendan. Why I wished Lord Derrington to be silent was that I might carry out my plan so as to learn who killed Mrs. Jersey." "Then you are looking after the case?" "On behalf of Lord Derrington. He has an idea that the assassin became possessed of a confession which Mrs. Jersey left behind her. How do you know she left it?" "Because I knew Mrs. Jersey very well, and as I told you long since, I was once a boarder here. One day she let slip that she had someone in her power, and would leave the evidence of that power behind her so that her niece might benefit. I told this to Lord Derrington. He insisted that I should try and discover the assassin so as to get that confession, which compromises him, back again. To spur me on he has promised me a reward of £1,000 should I obtain the confession and the conviction of the assassin. As I want money to marry Lola, I am doing my best. I came to live here for that purpose. Lord Derrington talking of my visit to the house on the night of the crime would have jeopardized my plans, therefore I was obliged, as you say, to threaten him so as to make him keep silent. So far, do you blame me, Mr. Brendan?" "No," replied George, after some thought. "The end justifies the means. But you might have adopted less rascally means." "I have not adopted any. I have not asked Lord Derrington for money, so I am not a blackmailer, nor do I intend to claim from him anything but what is justly mine." "And what is justly yours, if you please?" "The reward of £1,000 for the discovery of the assassin." "Oh, have you learned who killed her?" "Not yet, but I may learn. At present I confess I am in fault." George pondered a little. So far Bodsey spoke frankly enough, but he could not help mistrusting him. However, since the man was in the telling vein, he thought it best to betray no doubts lest Bodsey should turn rusty. "Well, the discovery is in your own hands," he said, "and I sincerely trust you will gain that £1,000. I am as unwilling as my grandfather that Mrs. Jersey's connection with this unfortunate business should become public. I am perfectly convinced that the person who took that confession stabbed the unfortunate woman." "Do you think so?" asked Bodsey, stealing a glance at the newspaper. George nodded. "The confession was written. I learned that much from Marjorie. Mrs. Jersey told her it was a story. Well, as the confession was not found among Mrs. Jersey's papers when she died, it must have been taken by someone. But I can't think what interest such a thing can have had for anyone unless—" "Unless what, Mr. Brendan?" "Unless it contained the name of the person who assassinated my father." "How could Mrs. Jersey know that?" "She was at San Remo when my father was killed. She loved him, and she used to follow him. How I learned these things, Bodsey, does not matter. But it is just possible that Mrs. Jersey, or Eliza Stokes as she was then, might have some knowledge of who committed the crime. If that was set down in her confession, as is highly probable, I can quite understand that the original assassin killed her to gain a dangerous document, such as it undoubtedly was." "Then you think that the assassin of your father was also the assassin of Mrs. Jersey?" "I fancy so, as I can explain the disappearance of the confession in no other way. And if I remember rightly, Bodsey, it was you who said that the San Remo crime was connected with the one committed in this house." "I did say so," replied Bodsey thoughtfully. He pondered for a few minutes, and then looked up briskly. "Well, Mr. Brendan, that point cannot be settled without proof, and there is no use our wasting time in indulging in vain speculations. Let me tell you about the night I went to see Mrs. Jersey." "Go on," said Brendan, crossing his legs. "I am all attention." "I knew before your grandfather came to see me that you were about to pass the night here. Lola told me. Yes, I was foolish enough to tell her, though to be sure I had no great reason to conceal my visit to Trayne. I never knew that a murder would take place. So Lola told you?" Bodsey nodded. "She did. But I never intended to bother about the matter, as I did not think there was anything in your visit. But Lord Derrington came and put a different complexion on the affair. It was his belief that you intended to force Mrs. Jersey into confessing about the marriage." "I came to appeal to her," said Brendan dryly. "There was no thought of forcing in my mind. Lord Derrington judged you by himself and thought there might be. I rather agreed with him.
Then, knowing his temper, I fancied if he went to see Mrs. Jersey there would be a row and a scandal, and I did not want that to happen." "I was making a very good thing out of Lord Derrington," admitted Bodsey frankly, "and if a scandal had taken place my occupation would have been gone. I therefore determined to drug him and to go myself." "But why in his coat?" "I thought that Mrs. Jersey might not admit me." George pounced on him at once. "There was no need that she should do so. You took the latchkey my grandfather carried." "Oh, you know that, do you?" said Bodsey composedly. "Then I may as well be absolutely frank." "It is your best course." "Oh, I'm not on trial, Mr. Brendan. It is only my friendship for you that is making me speak out." "I accept that excuse. Go on." Bodsey shrugged his shoulders to show his annoyance at the uncompromising attitude of his visitor. "I feared lest Mrs. Jersey should order me out of the house unless I could gain time by being mistaken for Lord Derrington. I drugged the old gentleman, and then, taking his coat and the latchkey, I went to see Mrs. Jersey." "At what time were you there?" "Some time before 12. I cannot say for certain. Well, Mr. Brendan, I let myself in with the latchkey, and I found the house by the red light over the door. In former years it had been my custom to guide myself in that way. I told Lola so." "Why did you tell her that?" "Oh, she knew that you were going late to the house, and made a fuss about the chance of your being lost in the fog. I said that probably Train would tell you of the red light, and that you could guide yourself by that." "Humph! Lola was always unnecessarily kind," said George. "Well?" "Well, I closed the door softly and went into the sitting room." "You knew where that was?" "Of course. Don't I tell you I once lived in this house? I entered the sitting room. The lamp was burning, and Mrs. Jersey was seated at the table." Bodsey shuddered. "There is no need to tell you more. I left the room at once, for the sight horrified me." "Why did you pause in the hall?" "I thought I heard a footstep on the stairs, and the shock gave me one of my fits, the fear of open spaces, you know. How did you come to learn that I paused in the hall?" "Because I had come down the stairs to see who was with Mrs. Jersey." "Ah! Then it must have been your footstep I heard," said the detective. "Well, I soon recovered, and left the house." "What about the stiletto?" "It was lying on the floor near the table. I saw it glittering in the lamplight. As there was blood on it, and I saw the wound, I knew that Mrs. Jersey had been killed by it. I slipped it into my pocket with a vague idea that thereby I might trace the assassin." "Did you leave it purposely in the coat?" "No," said Bodsey frankly. "I did not. I was so moved and, as a woman would say, flustered by the death, that I forgot all about it. Lord Derrington woke up and went home. I said nothing about the murder to him at the time. I had not the nerve. It was only after he departed that I remembered the stiletto. I thought he might make a row and accuse me of the crime. But he said nothing, and I judged it wise to let sleeping dogs lie. So that is all I can tell you, Mr. Brendan, and you will see that I am not such a bad man as you try to make me out." "Oh, you have spoken clearly enough," said George. Then, after a pause, "Yes, I think you are honest, so far as I can judge. I trust you." Bodsey looked delighted. "Will you have a glass of wine with me to show that?" he asked, rising. "On the Arab principle of bread and salt," said Brendan. "Certainly." Bodsey nodded in a pleased manner, and went to his sideboard at the end of the room. George mechanically took up the newspaper. His eyes were caught by a cross heading, "Strange Affair in an Essex Church," and by the words, "Destruction of the Registers." Just as he was about to glance over the article, never thinking what it meant to him, Bodsey returned with the wine and 2 glasses. He uttered an exclamation of dismay when he saw the paper in George's hand. "Hang it, I never meant you to see that," he said. "Why not?" replied George. Is it this news about a lady trying to tear the registers?" He started and looked at Bodsey, who was uneasy and pale. "It's Lola," said George. "No. And yet why should you not know? I believe it is Lola, though no name is mentioned." George picked up the paper again, and read rapidly. No name was mentioned, as it was said that the strange lady who had been arrested refused to give any name. It seemed that she went to Wargrove Church and asked to see the registers for a certain year, the registers of marriage. The sexton took the fee and showed the books. Then it appeared that the strange lady searched for an hour. The sexton left the vestry for a few minutes. When he returned he saw that she had torn a page out of the book. Being taken by surprise, she had tried to conceal her theft, but the sexton seized her, rescued the torn page, and called for assistance. The end of it was that the strange lady, who was described as having a foreign air, was arrested and placed in prison. "It is Lola," said George breathlessly. "Yes," assented Bodsey, also pale. "She evidently tried to destroy the evidence of your mother's marriage." George gave a cry. "Wargrove," he said. "Wargrove in Essex. It was in the parish church that the marriage took place. And Lola knew. Lola—" He paused. The eyes of the two men met. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 20. The Trouble of Lola. It was 4:00 when George left Bodsey. The two had spoken little of the newspaper paragraph which informed them of Lola's escapade. Although her name was not mentioned, there was no doubt in the mind of Brendan that she was the culprit. The newspaper gave the year of the book when the sheet was torn, and that corresponded to the year when Percy Vane married, or had been supposed to marry, Rosina Lockwood. And this was the explanation of Lola's absence from town. She had not fled from the rebuke of Brendan, but had gone to do him an injury by destroying the evidence of his parents' marriage. This finally was the meaning of her wild threat to Dorothy. By preventing George from proving his legitimacy, Lola hoped to put a final end to his chance of making Miss Ward his wife. Bodsey was much upset over the news. He would have flown immediately to Wargrove, but some special business kept him in town. However, he purposed to go the next morning by the first train. Bodsey did not think that Brendan had sufficient interest in Lola to go down to Wargrove at once. But George was going that very day all the same. Lola could not have known that his parents had been married at Wargrove without having seen Mrs. Jersey's confession, wherein the fact was probably mentioned. Therefore she must have obtained the confession in some way. How she achieved this George could not conjecture. Then he thought of Lola's hot Spanish blood, of the stiletto, a peculiarly foreign weapon, and shuddered. It occurred to him that Lola herself must have stabbed the woman. However, he put this thought aside for the moment, and set about getting to Wargrove. On consulting an ABC, he found that a train left Liverpool Street Station for Southend at 10 minutes past 5, and that Wargrove was a tiny rural town which could be reached in an hour. Ever quick and expeditious in his movements, George had entered a Strand shop to buy the railway guide, and having ascertained about the train, he simply stepped into his cab and ordered the man to drive to Liverpool Street. At the appointed time he was on his way down the country. This precipitancy of action was due to a dread lest Bodsey should change his mind and see Lola first. Certainly the detective had spoken frankly, and his conduct appeared to be dictated by sentiments of honor. Nevertheless, George felt that Bodsey was playing a part, and that this apparent honesty was not his real character. It behooved him to be on his guard against him, and to know as much about the death of Mrs. Jersey as Bodsey did, so as to be able to counterplot him if necessary. From the fact that she was in Wargrove, Lola evidently had possession of the confession. If Bodsey saw her he would doubtless try and get it from her, to learn the name of Percy Vane's assassin. George wished therefore to forestall Bodsey, and to make Lola surrender the confession, always presuming she had it, to himself.
For this reason he departed quickly for Wargrove. At the Liverpool Street Station he examined all the passengers as they entered the train. Bodsey did not put in an appearance, and as the next train would not depart for another 2 hours, George felt that he had stolen a march on the detective. Bodsey would never think that he had acted with such promptitude. It was a dull journey, as Brendan was worried by a commercial traveller who would talk politics. George put him off as civilly as possible, and finally turned his prattle, for it was little else, to his own advantage by asking for the whereabouts of Wargrove. It seemed that the new town of Wargrove was the place where the train stopped, but old Wargrove was 3 miles distant, and it was there that the parish church was situated. The commercial traveller followed up this information with many details concerning the manners and customs of the natives, which bored George to distraction. However, he listened quietly and paid as little attention as was consistent with politeness. His officious companion watched for the station and roared out the name when the train stopped. George thanked him and alighted, glad to be relieved of such a weary talker. And till the train was moving the man leaned out of the window shouting directions as to the best way to reach old Wargrove. As it proved, there was no necessity for George to go there. Lola was stopping in the policeman's house prior to her removal to the prison at Chelmsford. Her attempt at robbery had been committed on the previous day, and Brendan thought she would have already been removed. However, he was informed that there was some delay owing to the illness of the Chelmsford inspector, and therefore Lola would have to remain in Wargrove for another 12 hours. Brendan was glad to hear this, as it would save him a long journey. He thanked the policeman who had explained, and was directed by the man to the house of his superior officer, which was on the outskirts of the town. George soon found a semi-detached house with a notice on it, and on knocking at the door explained his errand to a brisk little woman. She pursed up her lips, looked inquisitively at him with bright eyes, and called her husband. The policeman was a burly, slow-witted, fat man who seemed nervous on being asked for a sight of the prisoner, for such Lola was to all intents and purposes. He did not want to exceed his duty. George produced a sovereign, but the official, although his eyes twinkled, hesitated to take the bribe. It was then that Mrs. Policeman came to Brendan's assistance. "Nonsense, Jeremiah," she said briskly. "Let the young gentleman see his young lady. She's dying to have a sight of him." "How do you know that she is my young lady?" asked George. Mrs. Policeman nodded with her arms akimbo. "Why, she's been crying out in that foreign way of hers for Georges, Georges." "That is my name, certainly." "And you are her gentleman. She told me what you were like, and cried all the time, poor soul. Tall, fair, with eyes of blue." "It's all very well," grumbled Jeremiah, "but 'tis against the law." "You can be present at our interview if you like." "There, Jeremiah, you can't have the gentleman saying fairer than that." Here the sharp little woman nudged her husband's arms. This was a hint for him to swallow his scruples and take the sovereign. Jeremiah agreed, and shortly the sovereign was in his pocket, and he was leading George to a back upstairs room. "We'd have put her in the best parlour," he said, "as I always like to make 'em comfortable. But she'd have run away, so we was obliged to keep her in the room with the bars on the window." Poor Lola, thought George as he conjured up the small stuffy room and the barred window. But the room was not so comfortless as Jeremiah stated, thanks to Mrs. Policeman. It was small, certainly, but it was neatly furnished as a bed-sitting room. The window was certainly barred, but there was no other sign that it was a prison cell. Before introducing George to this abode, it struck Jeremiah that the prisoner had been inquired for as "the young lady." He stopped Brendan at the door. "Might you know her name, sir?" "Of course I know it," replied George promptly. "Don't you?" "Now I do," said Jeremiah with a heavy nod. "But it was a rare time afore she'd speak. My missus got it out of her. Lollerville it is, she says, and she's by way of being on the stage. She is the most celebrated dancer in London, and her name is Lola Belez," said George. "I don't suppose she'll be punished much for this. She's mad at times." "Oh, if she's mad she'll get off lightly.
But them parish register to be torn, it's a bad work, that." "My father were a sexton," explained Jeremiah soberly. "And naturally you think Mademoiselle Belez has committed the most atrocious of crimes. But don't stand chattering here, my good fellow. I have to return by the 9 train." "I'll wait outside," said Jeremiah, on whom Brendan's generosity and peremptory manner had made an impression. "But you won't give her poison, or knives, or that, sir?" George laughed. "No, she is the last person to use them if I did supply her with such articles." "She's a lively young woman," said the policeman, and slowly unlocked the door. George was admitted, and then Jeremiah, so as to give the lovers, as he thought them, an opportunity of meeting unobserved, retired, locking the door after him. Lola and George were together. She was seated by the window, staring out into the darkness. On the table was a small lamp, and a fire burned in the grate. Lola started up when the door closed again. Who is? She asked in her rapid way, and came toward him. "Lola," began George, but he got no further. She ran forward and flung herself with tears at his feet, clutching his legs and wailing. "Oh, my dear one, hast thou come in anger? Trample me, make me as earth, beloved, but be not enraged. Ah, no, ah, no." "Lola, get up, and don't be a fool," said Brendan, speaking roughly to brace her nerves. She rose, sobbing, and crept to a chair in a slinking manner quite unlike her usual free grace. She did not raise her eyes, and George was pained to see the change. Badly as she had acted, he felt sorry at beholding her depressed, and like a sick beast in confinement. "Lola," he said, taking a chair near her, "I have come as your friend." "Not in anger? Ah, but yes, in anger." "I am not angry. I am very sorry." "Ah, but in your eyes, they sparkle. I see Mees Vaarts. I do try to steal the church books. You are furiously enraged." "Look at me and see." But Lola would not, so George took her chin and made her gaze directly into his eyes. Lola's were filled with tears, but after a time she began to smile. "Ah, you are not enraged. It was for you I did it. I wish my dear George to myself. All. You know that is impossible." "But it is not. I will have you." "Not at all," said George deliberately. "You will marry Botsey." "That pig, cow, horrible and miserable. No, ah, non." She sprang to her feet. "Jamais, au grand jamais. I do swear." And producing a small black crucifix from her dress, she kissed it vehemently. She was a most impossible person to deal with, being as wild as a tigress and as impulsive as a child. George made her resume her seat, and drew his chair close to her. Much delighted, Lola took his hand within her own and looked at him affectionately. Brendan did not like the position at all, but it was necessary to humor Lola if he wished to arrive at the truth. He spoke to her very directly. "Now, Lola, I wish you to tell me the truth." "Ah, but I will. When you are kindness, I tell you all." "Do you know that you have done a wrong thing?" "Pshaw!" she said contemptuously. "I give that old man's knocks on the head, but he is alive. Oh, yes, I did not kill him." "I don't mean the assault, though that is bad enough. But you're trying to destroy the register of the marriage." "It is your fault," cried Lola impetuously. "For loves of my Georges I did so. I wish you not to marry any but me." "We can talk of that later, Lola. Answer me a few questions, and make no remarks." "I will do what you say, my friend," said Lola, nodding. George thought for a moment. "How did you learn that Wargrove was the place where my parents were married?" "I tell not that. Indeed I will not. It is my businesses." "Mine also. You must tell." "But I will not." "For my sake, Lola." "Ah, you want to know all, and then trick me. I will not tell." "Then I will explain to you." "Aha, you cannot? You know nothings at all. Pah! La 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 la." George spoke sternly. "Lola, I know more than you give me credit for.
I have seen the dagger." This time he struck home, for she started. "What dagger?" "The stiletto you left in Mrs. Jersey's room." "I did nothings. I was not there." "Yes, you were. For all I know, you may have killed the woman." "But it is foolish you talk, Georges. I did not. She was frightened, oh, very much afraid." "So much that she gave you the confession you asked for?" "Ah, yes, yes, yes!" cried Lola, then seeing she had betrayed herself, she began to be alarmed. "Ah, you will say nothing. I would not tell Annise but my Georges. He loves me. He will not see me dead." "Good heavens, Lola! Did you kill the woman?" "That fat lady's in black silk? Ah, no, I did not. But she was so afraid of the knife." "You left her alive on that night?" "Why, yes, my Georges. We part, oh, such good friends." Lola blew a kiss from her finger tips. "She quite pleased. Immense." "Well, Lola, as you have told so much, you must tell me all." "There is nothing to say," she replied, turning sullen. George rose. "Then I shall go away," he declared. "I came here to be your friend, Lola, and to save you from getting into further trouble. But if you will not be candid—" He moved to the door. "What is Candide's? I know not, Georges." She sprang to her feet. "Ah, my heart, do not go. Soul of my soul, leave me not. I will do anythings what you ask of me." "Then tell me the whole story of your visit to Mrs. Jersey." "But you will marry Miss Ward." "I do that in any case. See here, Lola," he added artfully, "this marriage register which you wish to destroy does not matter now. My grandfather has acknowledged me as his heir." She looked at him with wide eyes and pale cheeks. "And you will be milord? You will marry Miss Ward? You will? You will?" Her mouth began to work piteously like a child being reproved. "I will always be your friend, Lola." "You will marry Miss Ward?" she persisted. "Lola," he took her hand, "if we married, we would never be happy. I and you are different people. Do you wish to see me happy?" "Ah, yes. If I die, I would have you happy," she sobbed. "Then allow me to marry Miss Ward, and give me up." "Ah, but it is asking much. Always too much." "Well," said George, a trifle cruelly, "you offered to die for me just now, yet to see me happy you won't deny yourself anything."
"Yes, yes. But it is all so quick, my dear. Give times. Oh, give times till I become used."
She sobbed for a moment, then dried her eyes and sat down briskly.
"I am ready, my Georges. You shall be happy, but you must not forget poor Lola. Ah, no."
"Of course not," replied George, patting her hand. "Now tell me the story. Wait. Was it your mother who told you of my father's death?"
"Yes," assented Lola. "She often talked of your father's."
"I heard she was in love with him," said George slowly. Lola shrugged her shapely shoulders.
"That I know not. My dear mother was handsome. Oh, yes, and dark, and fond of gayness. She might have loved. It is not impossibles."
"Did she ever hint who killed my father?" Lola shook her head.
"No, never did she say anythings. He was found dead, stabbed." She made a gesture. "That was all. All."
Evidently she could tell him nothing, so George reverted to more immediate matters. "How about that night? You knew that I was going to Mrs. Jersey's on that night."
"Ah, but yes. You did tell me."
"Then what made you come also? Was it to see me?" Lola put her finger in her mouth and looked down.
"No, my Georges. I did want that confessions of the fat old lady, to stop you being milord, and then I thought you would marry only poor Lola."
"How did you know about the confession?"
"That pig man told me."
"Bodsey? Why did he tell you?"
"Pshaw!"
said Lola contemptuously.
"He loves me, so I can twist and twist him so."
She made a rapid motion with her fingers.
We did talk of the death of our fathers. I lamented that my poor mother did loves your fathers unhappily, as I did love you. And I was enraged to think that your fathers had died. I did ask Bodsey who made the stab, gave the death. It is, so I asked," she added, nodding. "He could not say, but he declares that Mrs. What you call her? But my friend, Mrs.
Mrs. Jersey. Bodsey declared that she knew."
Lola nodded. "It was so," she assented. "Mrs. What you call that fat lady's? She write out all she know, of your father's death and of his marriages. I say to myself that I would get that confession and learn where the marriage was made. Then I would burn the book that no one might learn. After, I would say to you that I could tell who killed your father if you made me madame your wife."
"That's a very pretty plot," said Brendan, not knowing whether to be angry with her wrong doing, or touched by a love that to gain him would not hesitate to commit a crime. "So far you have carried it out. You have the confession."
Lola put her hand on her breast. "He is here," she said, nodding. "I carries him always, always."
"Give it to me, Lola." Her eyes opened in wide alarm.
"Ah, no, you will not ask me. I keep him to myself, all."
George saw that the moment was not propitious. But he was determined to get the confession before he left her. However, he begged her to continue her story. "How did you know the house?" he asked.
"It was the Scarlet Windows."
"I remember. Bodsey gave you that for guide."
"Bah! He knew not I was going,"
said Lola, with a shrug.
"I got out of him, the fool man, all that I did want. I thought I would get to the fat lady's on the night you were with her, that I might have you for helps if she was enraged."
"It seems to me that you protected yourself very well."
"With the daggers. Oh, yes. I said to myself that if my Georges did not come for the fogs, that Mrs. What you say? Jarzy? Oh, yes, would be enraged, and I would have trouble. I took the stiletto to save myself."
"How did you get into the house?"
"Wait. Wait. I did not dance all that night. I said I was ill, and I came always. I took the daggers and a cloak, and I went to the square. It is not far from my houses."
"No, you just turned the corner of the street," said Brendan. "Well?"
"I walked by the walls. It was after 10 o'clock. I walk round and round the squares, and I then see a red lights. The door open. It was open, and many people came out of the houses. The fat lady was on the steps waving her hands, so."
Lola waved her hand.
"A crowd was around. I came into the crowd, and when the fat lady was down shaking with the handshake, I did slip into the house."
"That was clever of you," said George, wondering at the dexterity with which Lola had managed to enter without exciting suspicion. "And then what did you do? Did you meet anyone?"
But no. I ran into a place. There was a room with a light, and that I did go into."
"Mrs. Jersey's sitting room," murmured George. "Yes?"
"I was afraid to be thrown out, my dear, and I hided behind a curtain of the window. The fat lady she did come in and close the door. She talked to herself of Lord Derrington coming, and did seem enraged at him wishing to come. You understand?"
"Yes. What then?"
"A little boy did come in with wine and cakes. She did send him away, being angry, and did close the door. She took from a box—"
"A green box, Lola?"
"Yes, a green box. She did take a blue, what you call, paper."
"A blue envelope?"
Yes, it is so. And she looked at a paper, a white paper she took from the envelope. She laughed, and said that Milord would love to have this. I say to myself behind the curtains, 'It is the confessions. I will have it.' Then she did put it in the envelopes and leave it on the tables. It was near me. I could steal."
"And you did," said George impatiently.
"But no, my Georges. I did try, and madame she saw my arm. With a cry she leaped to the doors. I come out and say that I wish to talk of the deaths of Monsieur Vanes. She turns most white, and did not cry no more. Then she asked me what I want.
You needn't tell all in detail, Lola. Be as short as possible.
Oh, well, but yes, assuredly. I told Madame I was of San Remo, and did talk of my dear mother, and of her love for Monsieur Vane. But this pig woman's insult my mother. I become enraged. I bring my dagger and wave it so.
Again Lola made a dramatic gesture.
I say that I kill her. She fall on her knees and hide her face. Then I did take the confessions out of the blue envelopes and hide it.
That was very clever of you, Lola. Did Mrs. Jersey see?
Ah, but no, she did not. I take it when she was with the eyes covered. Then having all what I was desired, and seeing her so afraid, I had the contempt look. I say, there, there, and I throw the dagger at her feet. Then I go to the door, and say I would depart. She begged me to stop. I did stop, and we talk of San Remo and of my mother. I say that you were my love, and that Monsieur Vane was the father of you.
Then she knew who I was on that night.
Ah, yes, but she did. I say you wish to see her the next day. She say, I will tell him nothing, and now go, for I have to see a great gentleman's. I was quite happy.
Did she not miss the confession?
No, I said nothing of wanting that. It was in my pocket. The blue envelope was on the table. She never thought but what it was within. Then she asked me to say nothing to any one about San Remo, and we part quite happy. She allowed me out of the door, and closed it again, oh, so softly. I saw her no more.
You left the dagger behind?
It was on the floors where I threw it. I wished to get away with the confessions, lest she should call me thieves. I did not wait for her to take the dagger. I departed. That is all.
Huh, said George. The story seemed likely enough. After letting Lola out of the house, Mrs. Jersey then came to see if he and Train were in bed. Expecting Lord Derrington, and knowing from Lola who he was, she no doubt expected George to interrupt the interview. But finding him, as she thought, in bed, she departed satisfied. Then she met Marjorie, and after locking her in her room, went down to meet her death. It was 11 when all this happened, and Bodsey in the coat of Lord Derrington arrived close upon 12. Therefore, as Lola left Mrs. Jersey alive, and Bodsey found her dead, she must have been killed in the interval, and whomsoever had done this had used the dagger left by Lola. However, George had learned all he wished to know in the meantime, and it only remained to get the confession from Lola. She refused to give it up. George entreated, cajoled, stormed, insisted. She still held out.
No, I will not. I will not, she kept saying.
Finally, he hit on a solution of the difficulty. If you do not give it to me, it will be taken from you when you go to prison.
Ah, but will it?
Cried Lola, wide-eyed with alarm. Certainly, and will probably be published in the papers. Keep it if you like, Lola, but don't blame me if you get into trouble over it. I assure you if you keep it, they will take it. Lola pulled a white packet from her breast and ran with it to the fire.
They will not have it. I burn, I burn.
And she threw the papers on the fire. George shot past her, snatched them out before they could catch a light, and thrust them into his pocket. Lola turned on him like a tigress, and he thought she would strike him. She seemed inclined to do so. Then, unexpectedly, she threw up her arms and fell into a chair, weeping.
It is the end. You love me no more. We part. We part. The confessions will part us. All, alas.
End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 21. The Confession of a Jealous Woman. George returned to town with the confession of Mrs. Jersey in his pocket. On arriving at the Liverpool Street Station, he wrote a note to Kolaski telling him of Lola's plight and advising him to engage counsel for her defense. He added that he would come around the next day to see Kolaski, and discuss what could be done toward extricating Lola from the mess she had involved herself in. Having thus done what he could, Brendan took the Underground Railway to Kensington, and alighted at the High Street station. In another half hour he was in his rooms. After making a good meal, for he felt the need of food to sustain him, he ordered coffee, and sat down to read the manuscript of Mrs. Jersey. The coffee was brought, George lighted his pipe, and having poked the fire into a blaze, made himself comfortable. The confession of the wretched woman, who had come to so tragic an end, was written on several sheets of foolscap loosely pinned together. Her calligraphy was vile, and George had great difficulty in making out some of the words. Also, the English was not faultless, but good grammar and fine writing were scarcely to be expected from a woman in the position of Eliza Stokes. But she wrote in a most cold-blooded way, and seemingly exulting in her wickedness. All through her confession ran a venomous strain of deadly hatred toward George's mother, and indeed against any woman who paid attention to Vane. Jenny Howard was not spared, and the woman Velez, who kept an oil shop, sneered Mrs. Jersey, was mentioned. When Brendan discovered that Mrs. Jersey had Italian blood in her veins, he saw perfectly well whence she got her savage nature and undisciplined affections. She was like a wild beast let loose among more civilized animals, and the wonder was that with such a nature she had not committed more crimes than those she confessed to. The woman was a dangerous creature, and Brendan, when he laid down the manuscript, thought it was just as well that she had been removed even by the violent means which Providence permitted. "My parents were of humble station," began Mrs. Jersey abruptly. "I believe my mother was a lady's maid. She married my supposed father, who was a butler. I say my supposed father, as I have reason to believe that I was the daughter of a certain Italian count, who had loved and betrayed my mother. In her moments of rage my mother would taunt my supposed father with this, but when calm she always denied that there was any truth. When I grew old enough to understand, she rebuked me for asking about the matter. 'You are my daughter,' she said abruptly, 'and the daughter of Samuel Stokes, who is the biggest fool and the greatest craven I know.' It will be seen that there was no love lost between my parents. My father Stokes, as I may call him, though I believe the Count was my real sire, was always very kind to me, and shielded me from my mother's rage. She treated me very cruelly, and when 15 I was glad to go out as a scullery maid, so as to escape her persecution. Shortly after I took up life on my own account, she died in a fit of violent rage, during which she broke a blood vessel. I think Stokes was glad when she died. She made his life a misery when she lived, and tormented every one around her. If I have faults, it is not to be expected that I could inherit a decent nature from such a mother. I never loved her, and when she died I did not shed a single tear. I remember singing at my work on the day I received the news. One of my fellow servants asked me why I was so gay. I replied that I had heard of my mother's death. After that they hated me, and I had to leave my situation. But had any one of them possessed such a mother, any one of them would have been as gay and relieved as I was. So much for my mother. As for my presumed father, Stokes, I saw very little of him. He retired from business and bought a public house. Then he married again, and was not inclined to see much of me. I did not mind, as I never loved him in spite of his kindness. I dare say I should have returned his affection, but my mother had beaten all love out of me. It is needless to give my early life in detail. I rose from scullery maid to housemaid. Then I became parlour maid in a suburban villa, where the wages were poor and the food was bad. I took charge of children when not doing housework, and managed to get on. But I was ambitious. I wished to get among the servants of the aristocracy. A friend of mine, who was maid to the Duchess of taught me her duties, and I procured a situation. I pleased my mistress, and she promised to do much for me. However, she died, and I was thrown on the world. I saw an advertisement for a lady's maid, and got the situation. It was in this way that I became the servant of that woman whom I hated so deeply. She was called Rosina Lockwood, and was no better born than myself. Her father was a low man who taught singing, and she appeared herself on the stage. I never thought she was beautiful myself. She had good hair, and her complexion was passable, but her figure was bad, and she had no brains. An inane, silly, foolish woman. How Percy Vane could have eloped with her beats me. But men are such fools. He would not look at me, yet I was 10 times as lovely as this singing woman, and quite as well born. Oh, how I hated her! At first I rather liked Miss Lockwood. She was kind to me in her silly way, and the gentlemen who were in love with her gave me plenty of money to deliver notes and other things. There was one gentleman who was the best of them all, and the biggest fool over her blue eyes and fair hair. His name was Ireland, and he had plenty of money. He came to learn singing from old Lockwood simply to be near her, and proposed 3 times, to my knowledge. But she would have nothing to do with him, which was foolish, as he had money, and she could have twisted him round her finger. Why he loved her so, and what he saw in her, I can't say. She had nothing attractive about her, so far as I could see. I was a handsome girl in those days, though I say it myself. But if a woman is good looking, why shouldn't she say so? I had a perfect figure, and a complexion like cream and roses. My hair was as black as night, and my eyes were sparkling and large. I taught myself to read and write, and I learned French. Also I learned to play the piano, and to conduct myself like a lady, as I always was. I often dreamed that I would marry a gentleman, and I could have done so, but that my foolish heart was captured by the only man who would have nothing to do with it, or with me. I never loved till I set eyes on him. There was a footman who wanted to marry me, to join our savings and set up in a public house, but I told him I was born for better things. Then a coachman asked me to be his wife, but I hated a man who had to do with horses. Oh, I had plenty of offers, as a handsome girl should. But I knew my own value, and looked about for the gentleman who would give me my rightful position as a lady. From my Italian father I inherited aristocratic tastes, and I was not going to remain a low, vulgar, common servant all my life. Not me. Then he came to the house. Oh, my adored one, my idol, my angel, how magnificent and beautiful thou wast! Percy was his dear name, and his blood was very blue. Lord Derrington was his father, a most aristocratic nobleman, who was an old brute, from my experience of him. But he was of high rank, I don't deny, and Percy had the blood of heroes in his veins. He came to take lessons in singing. But after a time I saw that he was in love with my mistress. Afterward I found out that he had seen her at a concert, and had fallen in love with her. I don't believe it. Who could have loved that bad figure and that silly brain? Now, a woman like myself. But he never cared for me, although I adored him from the first time I set eyes on his manly form. It was her arts that captured him, else he would have turned from her to me. But he never did. How handsome and fascinating was my hero, Percy Vane! Fair hair, and blue eyes, and the figure of a life guardsman. Just the kind of man I liked. He was kind to me, for her sake I suppose, and gave me money and presents. She said she loved him, and used to make me sick with talking of him. I let her think I was her dear friend, as if she had known my true feelings she would have sent me away, and then I would never have seen my hero again. I made the best of my position, for at least I saw him as often as she did, and that was something. They both looked on me as their friend. Had they only known how I hated her, and loved him! Lord Derrington was angry with Percy for loving my mistress, and I don't wonder at it, a low singing woman. Percy had some money of his own, inherited from his mother, and he proposed an elopement. He said that Lord Derrington could not leave the estates away from him, and that some day he would come in for the title. She never lived to be Lady Derrington. I was glad of that. I should have killed her had she reached that pitch of splendor. Her position should have been mine. But it never was. Well, they eloped. After singing at a concert in St. James's Hall, he met her outside and took her to Liverpool Street Station. I was waiting there with the luggage. We went down to a place called Wargrove in Essex, and the very next day they were married in the church of that parish. I was furious, but what could I do? Had I told Lord Derrington he might have stopped the marriage, but Percy would never have forgiven me, and I did not wish to lose sight of him. As Mrs. Vane's maid I had chances of seeing him daily, and of basking in the light of his eyes. It was weak of me, but I loved him so dearly that I could have done anything simply to be in his presence. But I wish now that I had prevented the marriage. Since I could not get him, I didn't see why she should bear off the prize. But I was a girl then, and sentimental and foolish. And she was a cat, as she always was. Afterward we went to Paris, and from that place Percy wrote to tell his grandfather that he was married. I know he did not mention the place, for the letter was given to me to post, and I opened it. I never gave it a thought at the moment, but afterward Percy's mistake in not telling where the marriage had taken place did me a lot of good. I should not now be writing in this house, but for that lucky omission. Lord Derrington would have nothing to do with his son, and there was trouble with Mr. Lockwood. But I don't think they minded much. Percy was wrapped up in the creature, and she loved him in her silly, simpering way. I pretended to be quite happy, but I inwardly was raging all the time. For his sake, I put up with the unpleasant position, and I never received my reward. Never, never, never. Oh, how some women's hearts are broken by the cruelty and neglect of men. I lived with the two of them during their married life. A son was born, and she died. I was glad when she died, and I was sorry she left the boy. Percy was wrapped up in the child and gave him to me to nurse. Mrs. Vane was buried in Père Lachaise, and then Percy, with myself and the baby, went to Monte Carlo. He gambled there in order to forget his grief, though I don't see what he had to moan over, seeing what a silly fool his late wife was. Percy lost money and wrote to his father, who declined to help him. Then he went to Italy and wandered about. Now that he was free I hoped to marry him. When not nursing that horrid child, he was called George after his maternal grandfather, and was a scrubby little beast. Some said he was a fine child. I could not see it myself. He was her child, and that was enough to make me hate him as I did. But, as I say, when not nursing him, I devoted myself to study so as to be worthy of the time when Percy would marry me. I knew that the future Lady Derrington would hold a high rank, and I qualified myself to fill the position gracefully. I did work. I learned arithmetic, and could write beautifully. I talked Italian and French like a native. I got an old artist to teach me to paint in water-colors, and I bought a book which taught the manners of good society. Also, I tried to dress well and do my hair becomingly. Percy saw the change in me, and congratulated me on the improvement which had taken place in me since leaving England. Had he only known that it was for his sake I had improved. As to that child, I should have liked to drown it, or to have given it to gypsies. As Lady Derrington, I did not wish to be troubled with her brat. Besides, Percy loved the boy so that he used to make me envious the way he nursed him. But had I got rid of the child, and I thought of 1,000 safe ways I could have done so, I should only have been sent away, and then some woman would have got hold of him. I thought it best to bear with my aching pain, and put up with the child, so that I might be near to watch over Percy. The end of it came in Milan. We were stopping at the Hôtel de Ville, and there was a waiter who fell in love with me. He was an English boy called George Rates, a horrid, scrubby, red-haired, nasty, pale-faced creature who worried me to death. Besides, he was younger than I was, and I wished for a husband to protect me. I should have had to look after George Rates, whereas Percy in the days to come would look after me. Besides, I felt that it was an impertinence for a low waiter to expect me to marry him, me, who had done so much to improve myself, and who looked forward to taking proud rank among the British aristocracy. At first I laughed at him, but he became such a nuisance that I told him plainly that I would have nothing to do with him. He then accused me of being in love with my master. I acknowledged it proudly. Why should I not? A woman should glory in her love. I did. I told George Rates that I worshipped the very ground Percy walked on. I gave my passionate feelings full vent, and bore him to the ground under the storm of my indignation. He told the other servants, and they insulted me, especially the English ones, as there were 2 or 3 in the hotel. I was persecuted, but I bore all for his dear sake. Then it came to his ears. Percy heard what I had said to George Rates. He called me in. He accused me of making him ridiculous, of being out of my mind, of 1,001 cruel things. I lost my head. I told him how I loved him. I knelt at his feet. I implored that he would reward my love, my long, long sufferings. He laughed in my tearful face. At that moment I hated him, but not for long. My life was bound up in his. When he dismissed me, I thought that my heart was broken. I was dismissed. He procured a new nurse from England, a Scotch hussy, as ugly as she was silly. I saw her often in Milan after my dismissal. Oh, that time! Oh, those weary days! I wept, I prayed, I moaned. I was a wreck. With what money I had I went to a convent near Milan, and stopped there for a month. But I could not remain away from him. I came out. He was gone. I went to inquire at the hotel. He had gone to Rome. Afterward a message came that all letters were to be sent to San Remo. I determined to go to San Remo, and to be near him. I would have died else. George Rates, who was still in love with me, proved a willing tool. I could not get to San Remo without money. He offered to advance me the railway fare, and he got me a situation in the Hôtel d'Angleterre as housemaid. He also was going there for the season as a waiter. I said that if he took me to San Remo I would marry him. He did so, and but that comes later. Sufficient it is to say that George believed in my promise, and that I found myself again in the presence, the heavenly presence, of my adored Percy. But I had only come to submit myself to fresh anguish. He saw me, but took no notice of me. I was afraid to follow him too closely lest he should ask the police to interfere. George Rates was jealous too, and I had to consider him as, failing Percy rewarding my love, I could fall back on George. He was always useful to supply the money for me to get back to England, where I was certain of a situation. I handled the situation in a masterly manner, and contrived to see Percy without his seeing me, and without exciting too openly the jealousy of George Rates. But it was the horrid girl that caused me pain. She was one of the daughters of General Howard, whom Percy had met at Como. The 2 girls both laid themselves out to catch my darling. But their arts did not succeed at Como. Jenny was the one who tried hardest to get him, but Violet took her chance also. When they came to San Remo they stopped at the Hôtel d'Angleterre. I looked after their room, and knowing what they were I made myself their friend. They knew me as the former nurse of Percy's horrid little son, and wondered how I came to be a housemaid. I told some story which satisfied them. I forget what it was. They believed in me thoroughly, and they found out that I loved Percy. Then they were amused, and I hated them for it. They told Percy that I was watching him, and he came to the hotel no more. But I still pretended to be their friend for my own ends. There was a masked ball coming off, and the Miss Howards wished to go and be known to their father. I entered into the spirit of the joke. I procured them 2 blue dominoes and each a sprig of yellow holly, so that they might know one another. They went to the ball thus disguised. I went also, in the same dress. I had got a third blue domino, and I also wore a sprig of holly. In my pocket I took a stiletto. Why did I do that? Because I was determined to kill anyone who tried to make love to my Percy. I knew that Jenny Howard, the little cat, would try and get him to love her, and I would have killed her with pleasure had she become Percy's bride. As I was masked, I had no fear of being discovered should I stab anyone, and moreover, were there trouble, the Miss Howards, being dressed as I was, even to the sprig of yellow holly, might be accused of any crime that might happen. Moreover, even if I killed Jenny, I knew that the two sisters quarreled, and that on the evidence of the holly and the domino Violet might be charged with the crime. Oh, I made myself quite safe. I am a clever woman. About the stiletto. I received that from a low shopkeeper called Velez, who was in love with Percy. She and her husband kept an oil shop, and her husband was very jealous of her. She was madly in love with Percy, as I found out when buying something at her shop, and I got to know her intimately, so that I could make use of her if the occasion arose. I did make use of her by getting the stiletto, and I took it to the ball. I heard Percy propose to marry Jenny, and I was minded then to kill her. I drew the stiletto from my breast, and would have rushed forward, hoping to escape in the confusion when I killed her. But my heart failed me. Even when she was left alone, my heart failed me. Jenny took off her mask, and I left her sitting waiting for Percy's return. Then I followed Percy and saw Violet join him. I knew it was Violet, owing to the unmasking of Jenny, and moreover, I had seen Violet listening as I was. She loved him also, the cat. However, I saw that she wanted to get Percy out of the place by making him think she was Jenny. She did. I followed. He took her home to the gates of the hotel and left her there. When he was coming back to the ball, I stopped him at the bottom of the parade. There was no one in sight, it was late, and a clear moon was shining. Percy thought I was Violet, whom he mistook for her sister. He addressed me in such endearing tones as Jenny, and remonstrated so gently about what he called the rashness of following him from the hotel, that I lost my temper. I snatched off the mask and poured out my wrath. Percy burst out laughing when he recognized me. He said— Never mind what he said, but it was an insult, and my Italian blood boiled in my veins. I drew the stiletto and rushed on him. At that moment my hand was caught from behind, and I fell. It was that man Ireland, who was then at San Remo, and a great friend of Percy's. He had wrenched the stiletto out of my hand. For a moment no one said anything, and I arose to my feet. Ireland addressed me as Miss Howard, Miss Violet Howard. Percy laughed again and corrected his mistake, saying that I was a lovesick nursemaid whom he had discharged. Then I lost my temper. Stop. I must say exactly how it happened. Percy was leaning against the parapet of the parade in a careless attitude. He did not even move when I rushed on him with the stiletto, and had Ireland not caught my arm I should have killed him. Ireland said that he had followed me, thinking I was Violet Howard, to ask me to return to the hotel. He talked some rubbish about a gentle-born English girl being out at night. But when he found that I was only a servant, there was no more of that talk. Poor Eliza Stokes could have been out till dawn for all these gentlemen cared. They laughed at me, Percy leaning against the parapet, Ireland beside me, holding the stiletto carelessly in his hand. As I said, I lost my temper, and I told Percy what I thought of that fool Rosina Lockwood. He lost his temper also, but that only made me more angry. At last he dashed forward, and I believe he would have struck me but that Mr. Ireland intervened. I don't know exactly how it happened, but in moving, Mr. Ireland evidently forgot how he held the stiletto, and put out his hand with the weapon pointing outward. In rushing on me, Percy came against it, and it ran right into his heart. With a choking cry he fell dead. I was terrified, and began to wring my hands. Ireland knelt down and found that Percy was dead. He seized my wrist, and told me to hold my tongue lest I should be accused of the death. I said it was his fault. He replied it was an accident. But I had got the stiletto, I had tried to kill Percy, and Ireland declared that if I said anything that he would denounce me as the criminal. I was terrified as I saw the danger in which I was placed. Ireland suggested that we should throw the body over the parapet onto the beach, and that it would be thought robbers had killed Percy. I agreed, and we threw the body of my darling over. Oh, how my heart ached when I heard it fall on the cruel, cruel stones. With Ireland I arranged to hold my tongue, and on his part he promised he would say nothing. The next day the news of the discovery of the body came. I was nearly out of my mind. Signora Velez, from whom I had borrowed the stiletto, knowing of my love for Percy, and being in love with him herself, accused me of the crime. I denied it, and said that if she did not hold her tongue I would tell her husband how she had loved Percy. She was afraid of her husband, who was a jealous brute, so she remained quiet. I gave her back the stiletto which I had obtained from Ireland. We were both safe, but I was so ill that I left the hotel and returned to England. George Rates, who never suspected my share in the death, followed. It was at this point that George ceased reading. He now knew the worst. His father had died by accident, and Ireland had been the unwitting cause of his death. Brendan wondered how the old man could have carried the knowledge all these years without speaking. He determined to have an interview with him. But at last he knew the truth about the death in San Remo. It inculpated no one, and he could not see how, according to Bodsey, it could be connected with the murder of Mrs. Jersey. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 22. Who Bodsey Was. George read the remainder of Mrs. Jersey's confession, and then put it away. Even when he got to the end he could not connect the San Remo crime with that of Amelia Square. It was in his mind to see his grandfather and tell the story to him, backed by the production of the confession. But on second thought he decided to see Bodsey first. He wired for an appointment, and received a reply stating that Bodsey was going out of town at 3:00 that day, but would be in his rooms until then. George lost no time. He called a cab, and within an hour of receiving the answer to his request he was on his way to Bloomsbury. On arriving he found that the detective expected him, and went to his room. Bodsey was still in a disturbed state, as he was most anxious to get down the country and to help Lola out of her difficulty. He received Brendan irritably and in silence. George saw that the man was all nerves, and did not resent his sharp greeting. He sat down and opened the conversation. "You are going down to see Lola?" he asked. "Of course. I am much worried over her. She may get into serious trouble over this freak." "Well, why not tell the judge she is insane at times? Then she will get off lightly." "Would that be true?" asked the detective, struck by the idea. "As true as most things. She really is not accountable for her actions when she gets into these frenzies, and in such a one she must have been to attempt the burglary." "Poor soul! I wonder how she is now." "Oh, she is not troubled much. Her spirits are as good as usual. She hardly seems to realize the enormity of her offense." "How do you know?" asked Bodsey with a stare. "Because I saw her last night." "You saw her?" "I did. After I left you I took the train to Wargrove, and had an interview with her." "You might have told me, Mr. Brendan," said Bodsey in a wounded tone. "Where would have been the use of that? I can manage my own business, I hope." "Considering how I love her, it is my business also." George shrugged his shoulders. "Well, you see, Bodsey, it was your intention to see Lola first. I guessed as much, so I stole a march on you." Bodsey fenced. "I don't see how you can say that." "I can. You know that Lola was in this house on the night the woman died." "I presume so, since she got the confession, and she must have secured it to know where your parents were married." "Well, then, knowing that, you wished to get that confession." "Yes, I did," said the detective. "And why not? I desired to know if Mrs. Jersey said anything about the San Remo crime in it." "I can tell you that.
She did. I have the confession." Bodsey bounded from his chair. "Where is it?" he asked. "In my rooms, locked away." "I do call that a shame," grumbled Bodsey. "You might have trusted me, Mr. Brandon." "Might I? Would you have trusted me?" "I do. You know I do." "To such an extent as suits yourself. But would you have shown me that confession had it come into your possession?" "You are not showing it to me," said Bodsey evasively. "That is not an answer. But I'll show you the confession whenever you like. Come now, would you have shown it to me?" "Since you have read it, why ask me that question?" snapped the detective. "You know Yes, I know that you would have burnt the confession. I know that to have a paper in existence which sets forth that Mr. Bodsey's true name is George Rates is not to your liking." "I never did anything to disgrace that name, Mr. Brendan." "That is between yourself and your conscience," replied George coolly, "and has nothing to do with me. You are George Rates." Bodsey shrugged his shoulders. "There is no use denying it," he said. "You have my wife's handwriting." "Was Mrs. Jersey really your wife?" "She was. We married soon after we left San Remo. She was hard up, or she would not have married me." "And you went to the States?" "We did. There I took the name of Jersey, and tried a variety of things, none of which came to any good. Then I left Eliza." "Why did you do that?" "Because she was a devil," said Bodsey, his face lighting up. "I tried all the means in my power to make her happy, but she was always quarreling and nagging and lamenting that she had not married that Vane, your father, Mr. Brandon." "Did she tell you about the murder?" "It wasn't a murder," protested Bodsey. "No, she did not tell me. But from a hint or two she dropped about getting money from Mr. Ireland I guessed that he had something to do with it. I came across to England, and I saw him. He told me the whole story." "Did you get money from him?" "I did not. I am an honest man, although you do not seem to think so. I left all that blackmailing to my wife. She came over to get money out of Ireland. He simply said that he would tell the whole truth, and would call the woman Veles as a witness about the dagger." "But that woman is dead." "Oh, no, she isn't," said Bodsey coolly. "Lola told me that she was alive and still in San Remo. She could have made things very hot for my wife. But failing Ireland, my wife, Mrs. Jersey, we will call her, had another string to her bow. She heard how Lord Derrington denied the marriage, and how you were living with your grandfather, Lockwood. She went to Derrington and I know the rest, and you came to live in this house." "Not at the time. I went back to the States, but as I could do nothing there I returned to England. Then I took up the private inquiry business and called myself Bodsey. I came to see my wife. She would not let me call myself her husband, and as I had no great liking for her I agreed. I was in this house for a few weeks, and then I got my own diggings. I saw as little of Mrs. Jersey as was possible." "Why was that?" "Well, sir," replied Bodsey frankly, "I didn't hold with the annuity she was getting." "In a word, you disapproved of the blackmail?" "That's a good, useful word, sir," said Bodsey easily. "Yes, I did. I never would take a penny from her, and when I lived here, during the few weeks, I paid my board. Yes, sir, I am an honest man." George stretched out his hand and shook that of Bodsey heartily. "I am convinced you are, Bodsey, and I apologize for my suspicions. But in some ways, eh?" "I didn't act very straight, you mean." "Well, sir, when one deals with a criminal case one can't be too careful. I have had to tell lies, sir. And I say, Mr. Brendan," cried the detective, with a burst of confidence, "I would not have shown you that agreement. I guessed that Eliza would state who I was, and I didn't wish you to think that I was connected with her." "Why not?" "Well, sir, I fancied, seeing what you know, that you might suspect me of killing her." "No, Bodsey. As you have acted so fairly all through, I am convinced that you are innocent on that score. But why did you say that the San Remo crime was connected with the death of Mrs. Jersey?" Bodsey opened his eyes. "Can't you see, sir? The stiletto." "Oh, you mean that the weapon used by Lola was the same one as my father was killed with?" "Certainly, Mr. Brandon. It belonged to Senora Velez, the mother. She gave it to Lola, for I saw it in her rooms before the death of Mrs. Jersey, and I recognized it from the description given by my wife." "But there are dozens of stilettos like that one. Lord Derrington showed it to me." "Yes, that's true enough. But, you see, from what my wife told me, I knew that she had got the dagger from the woman Velez. It wasn't hard to see, when I dropped across a similar weapon in the room of a woman also called Velez, that it was the same. Now you see how it is that Lola knew so much about the death of your father, and how she and I came to talk of the matter." "How did you drop on the subject in the first place?" "The name was enough for me. I saw Lola, and I fell in love with her, as you know. Then I remembered the name Velez and got an introduction to her. One thing led to another until I knew the whole story, and she admitted that the stiletto was the one with which Mr. Vane had been killed." George thought for a few minutes. "Tell me, Bodsey," he said at length, "did you suspect Lola of committing the crime?" "Yes, I did," admitted Bodsey frankly. "You see, she has a devil of a temper. I never knew that she had gone to see Mrs. Jersey on that night, although I might have guessed it because of the way she tried to learn the whereabouts of the house." "You mean the Crimson Light? Her excuse was foolish, I thought, the other day, when you stated it," said George. "But when did you first suspect her?" "When I picked up the stiletto. I recognized it at once. It was my intention to take it round to her, so that she should not be incriminated, but I was so upset, as I said the other day, that I forgot all about the matter. When I did think, it was too late, for Derrington woke up and put on his coat. I wondered whether he would mention the stiletto to me, but he never did." "Because he knew nothing about it," said George. "Mrs. Ward stole it, as I told you." "Oh, I see how it is now. But I really did suspect Lola. I asked her if she was in the house. She said that she had been, although she denied it at first." "That's Lola's way," said George. "She always begins by denial. How did you bring her to confess?" "I threatened to identify the stiletto. Then she told the truth, if it was the truth," said Bodsey doubtfully. "Oh, I think so. I don't believe she killed the woman." "But you know her temper." "Yes, I do. But since she has got what she wanted, the confession, there was no sense in her committing a murder. No, I quite believe that she threw the dagger at Mrs. Jersey's feet, as she said. It is just like one of Lola's impulsive actions." Bodsey scratched his head. "I wonder who did kill Eliza," he muttered. "If Lola is innocent, and I am innocent—" He looked at Brendan. "I can't help you," replied George, rising. "The thing is quite beyond me. It must have been someone in the house." "No," replied Bodsey positively. "Remember Mr. Train heard a door close, the front door, some time about 11:30. That was you, was it not?" "No, sir. I did not arrive till close on 12, and Mrs. Jersey was already dead. The door must have been opened and closed by the murderer, and he left just before I arrived." "But how could he have entered? You alone had the latch key. As to Lola, she slipped in while Mrs. Jersey was dismissing her guests." Bodsey shook his head. "I can't understand it, sir. Of course there was another gentleman who had the house for a short time." He looked meaningly at Brendan. George looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, sir," began Bodsey, with his invariable formula, "I don't like to mention names, and I am sure what I say will go no further, but there is Mr. Ireland." Brendan started to his feet with an agitated face. "Ireland? Oh, no, that's impossible," he declared. "Quite impossible. Why should he have a latchkey?" "After your grandfather's death he was in possession of the house for a time, and the keys would be with him. In handing them to Lord Derrington's agent he might have forgotten one." "It's improbable." "I don't think so. It was a chance, I think, at first, but when he knew that Mrs. Jersey occupied the house he might have found the latchkey useful to see her when he felt inclined. I dare say she tried to get money out of him again." "But he refused her." "He did once," said Bodsey meaningly, "but Mr. Ireland was not so young as he had been, and dreaded lest his accident should be known." "It was an accident," said George. "Much as I deplore the death of my father, yet I acquit Ireland of all blame. But he didn't know she lived here until Miss Bull told him." "Oh, yes, he did. I'm sure Mrs. Jersey would let him know that she was just round the corner. She always kept in touch with useful friends." "But why should he kill her so suddenly?" "Well, he might have heard that she had written out a confession, or even about Lord Derrington's visit. And then he would come round to ask her if she had incriminated him in her confession. He would ask her for a sight of it. Not having it, for she found the blue envelope empty after Lola left, she would deny that she had it. The stiletto left by Lola would be on the table. What was more natural than for Ireland to pick it up and kill her in a sudden access of dread? Remember, Mrs. Jersey could accuse him of the crime, as it was known that Ireland was jealous of your mother's marriage to Vane. Oh, there was plenty of motive. As to his having refused her before, he was getting old, and thinking he might be brought to justice by her confession, for he never knew when she would die or into whose hands it would fall, he might have lost his nerve." "It strikes me that if he struck the blow he had a great deal of nerve," said George dryly. "But you go on a lot of suppositions. You suppose that Ireland retained a latchkey of this house, that he knew Mrs. Jersey had written out a confession, that he knew my grandfather was coming on that night. In fact, that's all theory, Bodsey. I do not believe Mr. Ireland had anything to do with the matter." "Then who had?" asked the detective. "What would you say to Marjory?" "What, the niece? That half-witted girl?" "Exactly. Half-witted. She is more like an animal than anything human. She gets these sudden fits of rage. When Miss Bull fainted, Marjory rushed in and threatened me with her fists. Seeing what an uncontrollable temper she had, it occurred to me that she might have killed her aunt." "But Miss Bull says that the aunt locked the girl in her room." "Of course. But Miss Bull may know the truth, and may be shielding Marjory. She seems to have a strange affection for the girl. What if Mrs. Jersey, to vary the story, found Marjory down the stairs after Lola was gone, and instead of rebuking her, as Miss Bull said in the passage—" "At 11 o'clock, mind." "Later, I think," said George quickly. "You did not arrive till nearly 12, and the woman was just dead." "I don't think a few minutes would make much difference," said Bodsey quietly. "But go on, sir. Let me hear your theory." "Well, I fancy that Mrs. Jersey caught Marjory down the stairs, and took her into her own room to rebuke her quietly, so that the rest of the house might not hear. Also, she would be anxious to learn if the girl had overheard her conversation with Lola. If Marjory had, she would assuredly have told Miss Bull. Mrs. Jersey would be afraid of that, and I dare say she stormed at Marjory to make her speak." "But there could have been no row, sir. No one heard a disturbance." "Oh, the boarders are old and sleep lightly. But I am bound to say that I did not hear a disturbance myself," said George reflectively. "Mrs. Jersey may have argued quietly. Then, as you say, the stiletto was on the table. Marjory, goaded into action, might, with the sudden rage of a dumb animal, might have—" "Well, it's not impossible. But about the door closing?" "When Marjory saw what she had done," pursued George, still trying to guess what had taken place, "her first impulse would be to run away. She would steal out and open the door. I am pretty sure Miss Bull was on the watch and saw her. She would draw the girl back and close the door, at 11:30, as train heard. Then she would pacify Marjorie and lock her in her bedroom, after previously instructing her what to say next morning. That is what I believe, Botsey." "It's a very pretty case," murmured the detective, "and things might have happened as you say. But if it is the case, there is not much chance of learning the truth. Both Marjorie and Miss Bull will be silent. And after all, my theory regarding Ireland is just as good, Mr. Brendan." George rose to go. "Stick to your theory and I'll stick to mine," he said, smiling. "But what about Lola?" "Well, sir, I'll go down with Kolaski and see her. We will do whatever we can to get her out of her trouble. And you, sir?" "Oh, I shall have nothing more to do with Lola. Take her away to the States as your wife, Botsey, and I will get my grandfather to give you the £1,000 to start life on." "It's very good of you, sir," said Botsey gratefully. "And will you try and persuade her to marry me?" "Yes. She knows, as I told her, that, register or no register, my grandfather intends to recognize me as his heir. Therefore she is certain, as she may well be, that I shall marry Miss Ward. She will gradually get over her fancy for me, and will be quite content to take you." Botsey sighed. "I hope so. I love that woman, sir." "Yet she is a violent woman, almost as violent as your first wife." "Yes," assented Botsey, rather dolefully. "It seems as though I was always to fall into the hands of violent women. What do you intend to do now, sir?" "Leave matters alone, Botsey. I don't want to learn who killed Mrs. Jersey. Now I know about my father's marriage, I shall change my name, take my rightful one, and have done with all this crime and mystery. The Yellow Holly can go hang for me." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Yellow Holly, by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 23. The Turning of the Lane. The proverb says that good luck comes to those who know how to wait. It had certainly come to George Brendan, or, as he was now called, George Vane. After the interview with Botsey, the young man called at St. Giles Square, and related to his grandfather all he had learned. The old man was much astonished. "I don't think Ireland was to blame," he said, "not even in holding his tongue. After all, the thing was an accident, although undoubtedly that woman was the cause. Have you seen Ireland?" "Not yet, but I will soon." "Then tell him from me that I don't consider he was responsible, and that I quite believe, from what I know of Mrs. Jersey, that he has told the entire truth." "I will, sir," answered George. "I suppose you mean that if he really committed the crime with malice aforethought, Mrs. Jersey would have blackmailed him." Lord Derrington nodded approvingly. "You are what the Scotch call quick in the uptake, George. That is what I mean. Mrs. Jersey must have been afraid for herself, or she would never have kept her claws off Ireland's money. She had plenty of mine," added the old gentleman grimly. "Bad lot, George." "I quite agree with you, sir. Poor Botsey was honest, however." "Well," Lord Derrington did not assent immediately to this, "if Botsey had been really honest, he would have asked me to be silent on the matter, and need not have used threats, however unwilling he was to carry them out. No, George, Botsey is like the serpent in the bamboo, straight so long as it is kept in check. I suppose he will marry the girl?" "I think so. He is madly in love with her. I promised that you would give him £1,000 if he went to America." "The deuce you did!" said Derrington wrathfully. "Why not, sir?" rejoined Brendan calmly. "We want him out of our lives. He knows too much. Better send him abroad, so that he may not make any remark about this unpleasant family history." Lord Derrington winced. George certainly had rather an unpleasant way of putting things. However, the old man silently acknowledged the justice of the speech. "You are right," he said. "But Botsey ought to do something for his money."
You mean that he ought to discover the assassin?"
"Yes, I do. Whosoever killed that woman should be brought to justice, George."
Brendan looked down. "I think it will be best to let sleeping dogs lie, sir," he said significantly.
"Because of some scandal?"
said Derrington, looking hard at him.
"Are you alluding to the possibility of Mrs. Ward having killed her?"
At this supposition George laughed right out. "No, sir. I don't think Mrs. Ward would go so far as that."
"She would, were there no law to restrain her."
"I dare say. She has the instincts of a female despot. But as there is a law she would not jeopardize her neck." "No, I mean Ireland." Derrington sat up.
"Nonsense! Do you mean to say he is guilty?"
"I don't think so. But Botsey has an idea," and George related the story of the detective. Derrington grunted in a disgusted manner.
"The man's a born idiot," he said. "Why should Ireland run the risk of getting his neck into a noose for a second crime? If he thought that she would leave a confession behind inculpating him, he would have waited to make certain. I don't believe there is a word of truth in the matter. However, when you see him, you can question him about his doings on that night."
"I shall certainly do that," replied Brendan quietly. "But failing Ireland, and his guilt is presumed by Botsey, there remains Marjory."
"That idiot of a girl? Yes?"
George detailed his reasons for believing in Marjory's guilt. Again Derrington sniffed.
"It's all supposition. If the girl came into the room, if the stiletto were on the table, if Mrs. Jersey scolded her into a fury Pah! I don't believe it."
"And you really wish to find the assassin?"
"I should like to know out of mere curiosity. But if it is your opinion that things should be left as they are, why, Botsey can take his £1,000 and sail for America whenever he chooses. But I grudge setting the rascal up in business,"
added Derrington, who was still sore about the way in which he had been threatened. After this conversation George took his leave. Dorothy was out of town, so he could not visit her. After the interview with Ireland in Derrington's library, Mrs. Ward had found it convenient to go down the country. She felt that she was in an unpleasant position. Not that there was any danger of her being accused of murdering Vane. But if the police got hold of the story they might make inquiries. In fact, they certainly would make inquiries, and then the disagreeable fact would come out that Miss Bull was her sister. Mrs. Ward knew that she had not behaved well to Jenny, and that if the truth were known her friends would blame her. As Mrs. Ward did not like blame, and disliked to have her actions criticized, she went down the country saying to Dorothy she desired a change of air. Lord Derrington wrote a note to Mrs. Ward after George had departed.
"I'll ask her to come up,"
said Derrington grimly, as he sealed the letter.
"George will return in 3 days with the copy of the marriage certificate, and with news of how that case has been disposed of. Mrs. Ward shall apologize to him and formally consent to the marriage. Dorothy shall come also. And Walter—" Derrington rubbed his hands, chuckling.
He was rather anxious to see Walter's face when he heard that he was no longer the heir. Meantime, George went with Kulaski and Botsey to Chelmsford to see after Lola. Kulaski was in despair, as if Lola received a term of imprisonment his ballet would be brought to an untimely end. Now that Lola was out of the bill the hall was not so full as usual, and Kulaski foresaw that if Lola did not come back he would lose money. He therefore went down prepared to spend a large sum to set her free. But there was no need for fear. Lola was brought up before the magistrates, and evidence was given as to her excitable nature. The old sexton produced the torn register and detailed how he had been assaulted. He thought the lady was queer himself. Kulaski went into the box, also Botsey and George. The result of their evidence as to Lola's foreign ways was that the magistrate admonished her and inflicted a small fine. This was triumphantly paid by Kulaski, who returned to town with his principal dancer under his jealous eye. More than that, Kulaski made quite a story out of the events. It was known in London that Lola Velez had been arrested, as all the London papers copied the account of the trial which had appeared in the country press. Kolaski put it about that Lola had gone off her head owing to grief for her dying mother. Few people believed this, but the public was so pleased to see the favourite again that she was saluted with cheers. In a few days every one forgot about the matter, which, after all, did not amount to much. Luckily it was not stated why Lola had wished to destroy the register. There were several marriage entries on the page, and no one could say which of these she wished obliterated. Besides, Brendan got the magistrate to suppress the book, and not let the press report the matter. He accomplished this by telling the magistrate exactly how the matter stood. So the judicial authority used his power, and the Fourth Estate quailed. Everything was settled in a most satisfactory manner. Later on, Brendan had copies made of the marriage entry of Percy Vane, bachelor, and Rosina Lockwood, spinster, and brought them to his grandfather. The old man read them carefully, then laid down the paper with a sigh of relief. "I never thought I would be pleased to see that in black and white," he said. "And are you pleased now?" "Of course I am. You are to revive the glories of the Derrington Vane family. They have faded of late, but you, sir—" He clapped his grandson on the back, and George laughed at the old man's enthusiasm. "There is one strange thing," he said after a pause. "Seeing that my parents were married so near London, I cannot understand how the marriage was not discovered before." Derrington looked thoughtful also. "It is strange," he admitted. "But you remember the tale of Poe's purloined letter? People always look in the most unlikely places first, and because the church was so near to town, and nobody had replied to the advertisement, the searchers, I mean, must have thought that the marriage took place in some moorland parish where people never looked at the journals. It was the very closeness of Wargrove Church to London, George, that prevented the certificate being discovered sooner." "I suppose you are right," said Brendan, "but it does seem strange." "Everything in life is strange," said Derrington, "and not the least strange thing is that I kick out Walter to make room for you. By the way, George, he will be here soon." "Have you told him?" "Yes, and he wants to see you about the matter. I said that he could, in my presence. What he has to say I don't know. There is another reason for your remaining, George. Mrs. Ward and her daughter are coming here." "She won't be pleased to see me," said Brendan. "Oh, I think she will. After Ireland put her in a corner she grew afraid, and now she would like to see the matter settled at any price. When she is your mother-in-law, George, keep her out of your house or there will be trouble." "You must stand sentinel, sir. She won't come near me then." "Egad, that's true. She is afraid of me. I hold that stiletto, you see, and I know about her doings at San Remo. The minx!" said Derrington with great vigour. "I wonder that her daughter is so charming." "So good, you mean," said George fondly, whereat Derrington gave a sigh. "Oh, love, love, and again love," said he. "It seems I am going to have a most sentimental time with you two." "Be at rest, sir. Neither Dorothy nor I am sentimental. We are too serious for that." "That's worse. I hate serious lovers." "Then we will be gay," said George with a laugh. "Don't overdo it," replied Derrington with a kindly smile. "Be as you are, both of you, and I shall not complain. Ah, here is Walter. Well, my boy, have you come to see your new cousin?" Walter Vane entered the library with an injured air. He looked neater and more fragile than ever, and wonderfully old, considering his years. Derrington looked from him to the fine figure of George with a queer look in his eyes. "No one would ever take you for relatives," he said. "Why, they say we are like one another," said Walter. "Mrs. Ward remarked on the likeness when we dined with her. I wondered why we should resemble one another, but it is explained now." And Walter cast a not unkindly look in his cousin's direction. Derrington snarled.
George is like me, and you take after your father, Walter, who was a shrimp if ever there was one."
George hastened to the rescue of his cousin. "It seems to me that the conversation is getting somewhat personal," he remarked. "Walter, I hope you bear me no grudge for stepping into your shoes." Walter took the hand in his own limp grasp.
"Well, of course it is hard on a fellow," he answered in a rather whining manner, "but you and I got on well together, so I would rather it was you than another fellow. That train friend of yours, for instance, he's such a cad."
"But a very good fellow for all that," said Brendan dryly.
"Oh, people always say that of a fellow who has nothing to recommend him," retorted Walter. "But as you are the head of the family, I am glad you are not a bounder."
"That's very kind of you," said George dryly.
"And very silly of Walter," growled the grandfather. "What do you mean, sir, by talking rubbish? Is it likely that any one of my blood would be what you call a bounder?"
"No," said Walter, pacifying the old man. "I only mean—"
"Never mind what you mean. It's sure to be something foolish. This," said Derrington, pointing with his cane to George, "is the future head of our family. Pay him all respect."
"We'll get on capitally," said George, clapping Walter on the back.
"And what about my income?" asked Walter. "You will have what you have now," said Derrington. "Don't bother me about the matter. You and George can settle it between you."
Considering how he had been ousted, Walter really took things very calmly. But he had not enough vigor to protest. He sighed. His grandfather had cowed him, and Walter profoundly admired his newly found cousin, who did not hesitate to stand up to the despot. He began to think it was a good thing that George had come into the family. He would at least save him, Walter, from constant bullying. This interesting family council was interrupted by the entrance of Mrs. Ward, as pert and pretty as ever. She had quite recovered her spirits, and knowing that Derrington would say nothing about the card cheating or about the San Remo matter, she was prepared to be as insolent as she dared. But she was quite determined not to cross swords again with the old man. Like a burnt child, she dreaded the fire. Derrington was altogether too much, even for her. As it was, she came sailing in with the prettiest air in the world, and held out both hands, her head on one side like a sick canary.
"My dear Lord Derrington, how well you are looking! How—"
Here her astonished eyes fell on George.
"You!"
said Mrs. Ward, aghast.
"Mr. Brendan? And here?"
"Not Mr. Brendan," said Derrington, enjoying her confusion, "but my grandson, George Vane." Dorothy, who had remained below to give some instructions to the footman, entered the room just in time to hear this announcement. She flew to her lover.
"My dearest George, I am glad, glad, so glad!"
And before them all she kissed him. Mrs. Ward screamed.
"Dorothy! What manners!"
"Very good manners," said Derrington coolly, "seeing that they are natural. Well, Mrs. Ward, George, my grandson and heir," added the old man with emphasis, "has something to say to you."
"Really? I shall be most happy to hear it."
George took his cue. "I have to ask you for the hand of your daughter, Dorothy," he said, looking very proud and manly as he stood with the girl's hand within his own.
"Really?"
said Mrs. Ward again.
"I don't know. I fancied that Walter, you see—"
And she cast her eyes on the neat little man.
"Oh, I scratch," said Walter in his elegant way. "There's no fighting against George. He has all the luck." "You call him George?" "Why shouldn't I? He's my cousin, the head of the house."
"When I go to my long home," finished Derrington. "Well, Mrs. Ward, do you consent to the match?"
"Do, mother,"
said Dorothy imploringly. Mrs. Ward sank into a chair and pretended to be overcome by emotion. In fact, she did this merely to gain time, as she did not wish to answer too quickly. It was plain that Walter, whom she had wished Dorothy to marry, took, in her own phraseology, a back seat. George was promoted, Vice Walter resigned. George would be Lord Derrington, and would have the money. He was an obstinate man, certainly, and would be difficult to manage. Still she might be able to get the better of him. She could always work him through Dorothy, if Dorothy would only get over her absurd notions of religion and all that sort of thing. On the whole, Mrs. Ward thought it was best to agree. Knowing what Derrington knew, and how obstinate both lovers were, she did not see very well what else she could do. However, she made the most of her compulsory surrender. After a few sighs, and having squeezed a few tears, she cried to her daughter, in a muffled voice expressive of deep emotion, "Dorothy, my dear child!" Dorothy, with a look at George, went and knelt down by her mother's chair. She was not the dupe of this play acting, but, knowing that her mother would insist on making an effective scene, wished to get it over as speedily as possible. Mrs. Ward put her hand on Dorothy's shoulder in a maternal manner. "Do you love George?" she asked. "Yes," said Dorothy simply. "You know I love him." "George, do you love my child?" "I do," replied George curtly, while Derrington surveyed this touching scene with a grim smile. He always loved to watch the antics of Mrs. Ward. She believed in them so thoroughly herself, and they deceived no one gifted with ordinary intelligence. "It is hard," said Mrs. Ward, with a deep sigh, "to see a child leave its parent. But you love her, you have won her." Here she rose, and raising Dorothy from her knees, gave her to George. "Take her, George, and with her take a mother's blessing." The idea of Mrs. Ward's blessing was too much for Walter, and he went off into a shriek of laughter, which ended in his leaving the room. George was quite unmoved. He thanked Mrs. Ward and kissed Dorothy. Then he took her to a distant seat near the window, where they could talk sensibly. Lord Derrington was left to console the afflicted mother. This he proceeded to do immediately. "Egad, you did it well," he said, looking at the pretty woman. "I don't believe Miss Terry or Mrs. Siddons could have done it better." Mrs. Ward flushed a little, but still kept up the pose. "Nature spoke, my dear Lord Derrington. I am aware that you consider nature vulgar." "I was not aware that I did. I see so little of it that your scene touched me, positively touched me." Mrs. Ward saw that it was useless to hide the truth from this keen-eyed old man any longer. "Oh, don't be nasty," she said plaintively, and wrestled up to him. "Of course I wanted Dorothy to marry Walter, but George does just as well." "I don't think she has made a bad exchange, Mrs. Ward." "He's good-looking enough," said the little woman, "but so serious and dull. Of course, I suppose you'll allow him an income." "He shall have all that is necessary to keep up his position as my heir," said Derrington dryly. "I hope he and Dorothy will live here. The house is big enough." "And they won't have to pay any rent, which is always a consideration, isn't it? Oh, I hope dear Dorothy will be happy. I shall see much of her, much of my darling child." "No," said Derrington, thinking it just as well to nip these plans in the bud. "You care very little about Dorothy, and you don't like George. When they are married, you must stop away as much as is consistent with your feelings." "I'll do what I like," said Mrs. Ward, beginning to tap her foot. "No, I don't think you will. You threatened me in this room." "I was only playing a game," protested Mrs. Ward. "Well, I can play a game also. Mrs. Jersey has left behind her a confession, in which she details how you managed to cheat your sister, Miss Bull. If you don't leave that couple severely alone, I shall show the confession to Dorothy." "You would never be so cruel." "Oh, yes, I would," replied Derrington, who had not the slightest intention of fulfilling his threat. "I never did anything to my sister. Mrs. Jersey tells lies." Derrington made a gesture of disgust. "There, there," he said. "What is the use of talking further? Things are settled.
When Dorothy and George are married, I'll see what I can do for you."
Mrs. Ward's face became wreathed with smiles. She was such a frivolous, heartless little woman that she could change from one mood to another with wonderful rapidity. "Oh, thank you, dear Lord Derrington," she said artlessly, and pressing his arm. "I know you are the most generous of men. But I really can't stop talking here all day." She rustled over to Dorothy. "My darling, I must go and do some shopping. No, you can stay here. I will call again in an hour. George," she presented her cheek, "you can kiss your mother-in-law." George did so delicately, so as not to spoil the tint of the cheek. Mrs. Ward departed. "He's like a block of wood," she said to herself. "Never did a man kiss me so coldly before. Ah, the bear!" End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 24. A startling surprise. Having thus settled matters in a satisfactory manner with Mrs. Ward and Dorothy, George sought out Ireland the next day. He passed a delicious hour with Dorothy, and they renewed the vows they had made when there was little chance of a bright future. Now the future was altogether bright, and the two built castles in the air. George was to marry Dorothy, they were to take up their residence with Lord Derrington, and George was to enter Parliament on the first opportunity. "But you must not neglect your literary work," said Dorothy. "The novel must be finished." "I hope that many novels will be finished," said George, laughing. "I will be like Beaconsfield, and write novels between whiles of politics. It will be an amusement." "Which will be the amusement?" asked Dorothy. "Both. Politics is an amusing game, and when one has time to write what one pleases, and at the pace one pleases, that is amusing also. You will be my inspiration, my Egeria." "That is very like Beaconsfield," replied Miss Ward. "He always called some unknown woman his Egeria." "I am more lucky. I know who my Egeria is." More talk of this light and fanciful kind passed. It would have sounded foolish to sensible people, but George and his beloved were so happy that they talked nonsense out of sheer lightness of heart. At the end of the hour Mrs. Ward carried off Dorothy, and George took leave of his grandfather. It was the next day that he went to see Ireland. At the door he was informed that Ireland had been very ill with his heart, and that the doctor had been called in. Nevertheless, Ireland would not obey the advice of his physician, and stop in bed. He was up and dressed as usual, and in his study. George entered the large bare room papered with the gaudy advertisements, and saw his former guardian seated at his desk as usual. The man looked very ill. His large placid face was extremely pale, there were dark circles under his eyes, and he even seemed to have grown lean. His clothes hung loosely on him, and he did not rise when George entered. The young man knew that Ireland must be ill to fail in this courtesy, as he was extremely punctilious. "Excuse me, George," he said with an attempt at cheerfulness, "but I am not so well as I might be." "You are looking ill, very ill," said George, taking his seat. Ireland nodded. "I can't live long," he remarked in his heavy voice, "so the doctor informs me. My heart is extremely weak. I may die at any moment." George was shocked. "It's not so bad as that, I hope," he said. "It's as bad as it well can be. For the last few days I have deviated sadly from my usual habits. I have not taken a walk, and my system of life is quite upset. It's the beginning of the end." He paused and sighed. "You are looking well, George." "I have every reason to. Mrs. Ward has consented to my marriage." "With her daughter? How is that?" "Well, the church where my parents were married has been discovered." Ireland looked interested. "That is good news. Where were they married?" "In Wargrove Church. It is a parish in Essex, an hour's journey from town. Quite a small place." Ireland made the same remark that George himself had made. "Strange," he said, "that being so near the town the place was not discovered before. I have no doubt that your advertisement set many people hunting. Well, I'm glad that the marriage has been proved at last, both for your sake and in justice to the woman I loved, to her dear memory. She was Rosina Vane after all. That has been proved beyond a doubt. My grandfather has seen the copy of the certificate, and now holds it." "Is he pleased?" "Very pleased. He is now as friendly toward me as he has been hitherto hostile." Ireland nodded, breathing heavily. "I thought he would be. He and I had a long talk about you on the day I called. That was when I saw Mrs. Ward, and—" "You can go on," said George, seeing his hesitation. "I know the whole story." "What story?" asked Ireland suspiciously. "The story of what happened at San Remo. Mrs. Ward, I know, was Violet Howard, and her sister Jenny is Miss Bull." "Yes. Poor Jenny. She was the better of the two. And now she drags out a miserable life in a London lodging house; while Violet, who is a bad woman—" "And the mother of Dorothy," interrupted George imperiously. "Say no more, sir." "You are quite right. As I can't say good of the woman, let me say no bad. Well, you know how she loved your father. I think she flirted with him, but it was Jenny who really loved." "And look at her reward," said Ireland with a deep sigh. "Those who try to do their best always come off worst. I loved your mother, George, and I have been a lonely man all my life." It was a sad case. George wished to get at the truth, but he was so sorry for Ireland, who had passed so many miserable years, that he did not like to inflict more pain. Nevertheless, it was necessary to learn if Ireland had really visited Mrs. Jersey on that night, so as to set Bawdsey's mind at rest. If George did not learn the truth, Bawdsey might attempt the discovery, and he would handle the old man in a much worse manner than George was likely to do. While pondering how he could set about his unpleasant task, George was saved from making the first step, always the most difficult, by an observation from Ireland which paved the way to an explanation. "How did you discover the church?" he asked idly. "In a rather queer way. Lola Velez—" Ireland opened his eyes, which had been closed, and looked up. "Who is Lola Velez?" he asked anxiously. "She is a dancer whom I helped. Oh, quite in a proper way, Mr. Ireland. You know the name?" Ireland, contrary to George's expectation, nodded. "There was a woman in San Remo about the time of your father's death. She was called Velez, and was in love with him." "He seems to have been a fascinating man," said George, smiling, to set Ireland at his ease. "But this Lola is the daughter of the woman you mention. It was she who found the church." By this time Ireland was quite awake, and keenly anxious for details. "How did she learn its name?" he demanded quickly. "She found it in the confession of Mrs. Jersey." Ireland snapped the paper cutter he was holding, and leaning back in his chair looked anxiously at George. "What do you mean?" "Well," replied the young man, keeping his eyes fixed on Ireland's face, "it seems that Mrs. Jersey left a confession behind her as to what took place at San Remo." "Who has that confession?" "I have. I got it from Lola." "And how did she manage to obtain it?" For answer George related how Lola had called to see Mrs. Jersey, and how she had managed to steal the confession. "It was from reading it," finished George, "that she learned of the church in which my parents were married. Desiring that I should marry her, and thinking I would not do as where my birth proved, she went to the church to destroy the registers. She was caught with the torn leaves, and arrested." "Arrested?" "Yes. I wonder you did not see the case reported in the papers." "I have been too ill to read the papers lately," said Ireland, looking round the room in rather a helpless way.
And none of my servants told me. What happened? Oh, Lola was let off with a small fine. She is now back dancing at her music hall. She gave the confession to me." "Did anyone else see it? The authorities?" "No. You can set your mind at rest, Mr. Ireland. I got it from Lola before she was taken to prison. No one has seen it but myself and Lord Derrington." Ireland drew a long breath of relief. "You made a strange remark just now, George," he said, not looking at the young man. "You told me to set my mind at rest. Why did you say that?" "I have read the confession," said George quietly. Mr. Ireland rose from his chair and began to pace the room. He seemed so weak that George wished him to return, but the old man waved his hand impatiently. "It's all right, it's all right," he said, then stopped opposite to George. "Then you know." "I know that my father's death was due to an accident." "What? Did that wretched woman tell the truth?" "She told the truth." "And she did not accuse me of having murdered your father?" "No, she did not. I suppose she thought it was as well to go to her long home with as few sins as possible on her conscience. But she certainly exonerated you." "Thank God for that," said Ireland, and returned to his seat. Then he looked at his visitor in a piteous manner. "George," he said in faltering tones, "I have suffered greatly on account of that most unhappy accident." "I'm sure you must have, sir. But don't let it worry you any more. It was an accident, and both Lord Derrington and I heartily forgive you for having been the unconscious cause of my father's death." Ireland nodded. "Thank God again," he said solemnly. "Your father and I were not very good friends, as I found it difficult to forgive him for having taken from me the woman I loved; but at San Remo we got on better together. I stifled my resentment so that I might see as much of you as possible, George. Knowing that I was not on good terms with Vane, I thought that Mrs. Jersey might have accused me of the crime. She did try to get money out of me." "So Bodsey told me." "Bodsey? Who is he?" "I forget you don't know. He is a private inquiry agent who has been looking after the case on behalf of Lord Derrington. I learned from the confession of Mrs. Jersey that he is her husband." "George Rates. I remember. She told me she married him and went to America. It was after her return from America that she tried to get money out of me. I refused. Not that I did not realize the danger to which she could expose me, but I knew that if I once yielded I would be in her power. Besides, I had a defense, as she got the stiletto from the woman Velez." "And it was with that same stiletto that Mrs. Jersey was killed." "By whom?" asked Ireland. "Did her husband?" "No. We do not know who killed her. Perhaps you may know." "I?" Ireland looked genuinely surprised. "No. How should I know?" "Well," said George rather awkwardly, "it seems that Bodsey has got it into his head that you knew about this confession." "I did not." "That you were afraid it would be published after her death, and that you went to the house on that night to get it." "I did not. How could I have entered the house?" "Bodsey thinks you had a latchkey." "No. All the keys were handed to Lord Derrington's agent when the house was sold. In plain words, George, this man Bodsey, Rates, whatever he calls himself, accuses me of the murder." "He doesn't exactly accuse you, but—" "I don't know what else you would call his statements but accusations," retorted Ireland with some heat. "But I never was near the house. I certainly thought that Mrs. Jersey might leave some such confession, but I never asked her about it. I never thought that such a healthy woman would die before me, and I knew that sooner or later my bad heart would carry me off in spite of the regularity of my life." "Then you cannot guess who killed her?" "No. I was never near the house. I was in bed and asleep. My servants will tell you so."
"I need not ask them," said George quickly. "I never thought you were guilty, and I only came to receive your assurance, so that I might tell Bodsey and prevent him troubling you." "If Bodsey comes here, I'll soon make short work of him," said Ireland sharply. "I am not afraid." "You need not be. Mrs. Jersey's own confession exonerates you." "I don't mind even that. I would have faced the worst had it to be faced. I never was a coward, except in one thing." He paused, and looked timidly at George. "I shrank from telling you how I was the unhappy cause of your father's death." "You were not the cause, in my opinion. Mrs. Jersey was the cause." "Well, I thought you would shrink from me did you know all." "I do know all, and I do not shrink from you," replied George, leaning across the desk to shake Ireland's hand. "It was a pure accident, and has been related by your enemy." "I am so glad the truth is known to you at last," faltered the old man, "and that you see how unconsciously I caused the death. You are her son, George, the son of the only woman I ever loved, of the woman for whose sake I have remained lonely all these years. Had you condemned me—" His emotion prevented him from saying more. George grew alarmed by his pallor. "Please think no more of the matter, Mr. Ireland," he said. "You are ill. Go and lie down." "Yes, I'll lie down." Ireland leaned heavily on George's arm. "I shall lie down forever. But I am glad, you know. I am glad you are not angered." "We are the best of friends, Mr. Ireland. You have always been kind to me. And I am sure my dead mother blesses you for all your goodness to her orphan boy." "Rosina, Rosina," murmured Ireland. "How I loved her! You have her eyes, George, and her kind nature. Come, let me get to bed. Soon the curtain will drop. I am afraid my visit has been too much for you." "No, I am glad you came. I am glad you spoke out. I always intended to do so, but I feared lest you should blame me." By this time they were ascending the stairs. George conducted the old man to his room and sent for the doctor. Ireland undressed and got to bed. Then he insisted on George leaving him. "But you are ill," protested the young man. "I am dying, but what of that? I am glad to die. I shall meet Rosina again after long, long years of sorrow. Go, George. We understand one another, and you have forgiven me. There is no more to be said." "There is nothing to forgive," replied George softly. Then, to humor his old guardian, he departed. A strong grip of the hand was exchanged between them. George left the room and saw Ireland lying as still as any corpse. Only his lips moved, and they murmured continuously, "Rosina, Rosina." He was true to the woman he loved to the very end. George left the house, as there was nothing he could do, but he intended to call in again. Meanwhile he repaired to Amelia Square to see Bodsey. Derrington wished him to tell the detective to stop looking after the case, and discharge him from his employment. In his pocket George had a cheque for £1,000, and when this was paid the whole case was to be relegated to obscurity. Now that Derrington was reconciled to his grandson, he was anxious, for obvious reasons, that the sordid tragedy of Mrs. Jersey's death should not come to light. He had not played a very respectable part in it himself, and moreover he did not wish that confession published. It would only be a case of washing the family linen in public, and both George and he agreed that this was undesirable. The sooner Bodsey married Lola and went to America the better, Derrington thought. And for his own sake Bodsey would hold his tongue, seeing what a close connection he was of the dead woman. Bodsey was at home, and saw George at once. He looked rather excited, and could hardly keep his seat. "Well, Mr. Brendan," he asked, "what is it?" "I should rather ask you that," said George.
You seem excited." "Not very. Only I have been fortunate in some business, and—" "What is the business?" "I'll tell you that later. What is yours?" "A pleasant one," rejoined George. "Here is the cheque for £1,000 which my grandfather promised you. Marry Lola, and go to the States, and stop searching for the assassin of Mrs. Jersey." "Thank you," replied Bodsey, taking the cheque eagerly. "Your grandfather is a prince, Mr. Brendan. As to the case, why should I stop searching?" "You will never find the assassin." "Pardon me," said Bodsey in high glee, "I have found the assassin. Yes," as George uttered an ejaculation, "Miss Bull killed Mrs. Jersey."
End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Yellow Holly by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 25. The Truth. George stared at the triumphant detective in surprise. It seemed impossible that what he stated could be true. Miss Bull was the very last person whom Brendan would have accused. No one had been more candid than she had been, and no one at the time of the discovery of the crime had done more to help the detectives. "You must mean Marjorie," said George, after a time. "No, I don't," replied Bodsey in a determined voice. "I mean that little white old woman with the black eyes, Miss Bull, or as you know her, Miss Jenny Howard." "But what reason?" "Ah, that's a long story. She shall tell you herself." "Have you had her arrested?" "Not yet. But she will be arrested before the end of the day. I have already communicated with Scotland Yard." George rose and walked to the window. He felt irritable and upset now that the truth had come to light. He wished that Bodsey had not been so confoundedly interfering, and the detective's next words annoyed him still further. "It was your idea about Marjorie that put me on the scent," he said, with great complacency. "Though, to be sure, I had my suspicions before. It was to watch Miss Bull that I came here." "What made you think that she was guilty?" "She has confessed, in the calmest manner, too, that—" "I mean before. Why did you suspect her?" "Well, it seemed to me that she was the only person who could have killed Eliza. She and Eliza hated one another because of their mutual love for your father." George groaned. What a lot of trouble his father had caused with his handsome looks and charming manners. Even after his death the fatal attraction he exercised seemed to bring about disaster. "She did not kill Mrs. Jersey on that account," he said. "Wait till you hear. She will tell you. In fact, she asked me to send for you, as she wishes to speak." "Where is she now?" "In the famous sitting room, playing patience." "Doesn't she realize the peril of her position?" "In a way she does. But she seems quite ready to face the worst." "Poor woman," said George, thinking of the sad life which the old maid had led. "If she has sinned, she has suffered." "If people use knives in that way they must be punished," was the rather harsh retort of Bodsey. "Don't talk stuff, Bodsey. You have your own sins to think of." "I never committed murder." "No one said you had, but you may do so before you die." Bodsey shuddered. "I hope not, Mr. Vane," he said. "I don't know why you should say such a thing. I am an honest man." "You say that so often that I shall begin to disbelieve it," replied Brendan, rather cynically. "But if you marry Lola, either you will kill her, or she will kill you." "I'll take my chance of that. And if you—" George made an impatient gesture with his hand, and returned to his seat. "Never mind further chatter. Let me hear how you came to learn that this poor creature struck the blow." "If you talk that way of a criminal, Mr. Vane, what will you say of a good woman?" "My good man, there is more joy over a sinner that repenteth." "But Miss Bull doesn't repent," said Bodsey. "I'll hear the story before I give an opinion on that point. You say that it was some remark I made which—"
Yes, it was," said Bodsey eagerly and throwing himself into a seat. "Your remark that Marjorie might be guilty—" "One moment," interrupted George in his turn. "I may tell you that I have seen Mr. Ireland, and he declares that he never was near the house on that night, that he knew nothing of the confession, and that he had no latchkey. He is innocent." "Now that I have heard Miss Bull, I know that, sir. She's the one." "Well, and how did you find out?" Bodsey cleared his throat and began with a most important air. "I rather agreed with your idea that Marjorie might be guilty," he said, "and when I turned it over in my own mind I thought it more and more probable. I therefore determined to get Marjorie alone and work on her fears." "Pah!" said Brendan with disgust. "Well, sir," retorted Bodsey, shrugging his shoulders, "I had to get at the truth somehow, and detectives' work is not all so honourable as novelists make out. I got Marjorie alone." "And how did you set to work?" "Well, it was this morning in the sitting room. Miss Bull had gone out, and had left Marjorie to make up some accounts. The girl was labouring away at them, and getting into a hopeless mess. I came to speak with her, and offered to do them. I soon put the accounts to rights, and then began to talk of Miss Bull." "Why of Miss Bull?" "Why," Bodsey pinched his lip, "I thought at the time that Marjorie was guilty, and that if in talking to her I laid the blame on Miss Bull that the girl would speak out." "You traded on the poor wretch's friendship. Bodsey, I'm ashamed of you." "I'm ashamed of myself," replied the detective penitently. "But Lord bless you, Mr. Vane, one gets used to this sort of thing. In our business the means justify the ends far more than in religion." "I certainly don't think it justifies any end in religion," said George sharply. "Well, you accused Miss Bull of the crime?" "In a way I did. Marjorie denied it." "What did you say?" "That she might as well confess. I declared that I had evidence to prove Miss Bull's guilt, and that she would be arrested when she came back. I declare, Mr. Vane, I thought that girl would strike me. She was like a wild cat." "I wish she had," growled George, whose generous spirit was revolted by the use Bodsey had put Marjorie to. "She said if I arrested Miss Bull she would kill me. I said, 'As you killed your aunt?' She up and said, 'Yes, I did kill her. Miss Bull is innocent, and you know she is.' Of course, when she admitted the fact, I at once began to suspect Miss Bull." "Why did you do that?" "Because if Marjorie had been guilty she would not have owned up. But if Miss Bull was guilty, Marjorie would certainly take the guilt on herself." "Poor girl," murmured George. "There is something noble in that dull soul." Bodsey could not see this, and mentally disagreed with it. However, he did not want to argue down Brendan's too tender conscience, so he went on with his recital. "While Marjorie was threatening me and taking the guilt on herself, Miss Bull came in. That stupid girl ran to tell her and fell at her feet, crying that I knew all, but that she would die for her dear Miss Bull." "And what did the woman say?" "She asked me if I knew. I said I did. She demanded how I found out. I told her that that was my business. She began to smell a rat, and suspected that I was bluffing. She would have held her tongue, but Marjorie was in such terror for her friend that she came out with the whole story. Miss Bull tried to stop her, but Marjorie kept repeating that she would die for her dear Miss Bull, and so let the cat out of the bag." "The girl is half-witted. All this may not be true." "Oh, yes, it is. When Miss Bull saw that the game was up, she sat down and admitted that she had killed Mrs. Jersey. She also said that she was glad the truth had come to light, that she wished to die, and so on." "She was raving," said George incredulously, not thinking anyone would incriminate himself or herself so freely. "No, she wasn't. She told me the whole story in the calmest manner, just as though she were asking me to have a cup of tea. Then she asked me to send for you, and sat down to play patience. "I wonder you are not having her watched," said George with scorn. "Oh, she won't run away," replied Bodsey easily, and not perceiving the irony of the remark. "Come along, Mr. Vane. We'll go down and see her. She is desperately anxious to see you." "Do any of the boarders know?" "Not yet, but they will when she is arrested." George shuddered and followed Bodsey down the stairs. It seemed terrible to him that such a fragile little creature as Miss Bull should be subjected to this disgrace. He did not condone her crime. She had acted wrongly, and must take the consequences. But he could not forget that she was Dorothy's aunt, and he wished he could see some way of rescuing her from this dreadful position. Miss Bull was, as Bodsey had stated, playing patience. Seated at the very table where her victim had sat, she dealt the cards, and seemed quite interested in the game. Marjorie was seated in a chair near at hand, looking with tearful eyes into the face of her friend. Beyond the fact that Miss Bull was whiter than usual, she showed no signs of emotion. "You have come, George," she said, addressing him by his name. "I am glad to see you. Mr. Bodsey, you may go." The detective was taken aback, and would have remonstrated, but Marjorie rose and approached him. "You have done your worst," she said, her eyes flashing. "Go, or I'll twist your neck." Bodsey shrugged his shoulders, and with a glance at George went out. After all, he had heard the story before, and did not particularly care to hear it again. Besides, Bodsey was a kindly man, and he felt sorry that he had proceeded to such extremities. Miss Bull shuffled her pack of cards, and laid them away in a box. "I shall play that game no more," she said. "I have been playing patience all my life, but the end has come, and I am glad it has come. Hush, Marjorie," for the girl had burst into tears. "I will see that you are left well off, and looked after, my dear." "I don't want that. I want you," sobbed the girl. She slipped to the floor and laid her head on Miss Bull's knee like a faithful dog. Miss Bull patted her head, and allowed her to remain in this position while she spoke to George. Marjorie sobbed for a time, and then remained quiet, listening to every word, and quite content to feel the gentle hand of the old maid smoothing her hair. "I suppose you were astonished when Mr. Bodsey told you," said Miss Bull, looking with piercing eyes at Brendan. "I was. I never thought that you " "That I would kill Mrs. Jersey," finished the woman quietly. "Why not? She was a bad, wicked creature, and caused the death of your father. She boasted of it." "Where? When?" asked the astonished young man. "In this very room, in my presence. But to make you understand, I had better tell you all." "One moment, Miss Bull. When you told the fortunes on that night, did you intend to kill Mrs. Jersey?" "No. The death card did turn up. That was a strange coincidence, George. When I came down the stairs, I had no more idea than you of killing the wretched woman." "What made you do it?" "I am telling you," replied Miss Bull, folding her hands on her lap. "Wait, and hear. Mrs. Jersey was very rude to me on that night. I intended to remonstrate with her. She added insult to injury by locking Marjorie in her bedroom so as to keep her from me. I heard her scolding Marjorie in the passage, and when all was quiet, and Mrs. Jersey had gone down the stairs, I went up to Marjorie's room and unlocked the door. Mrs. Jersey had struck the poor child, and she was sobbing on her bed. I then determined to go down for the second time and see Mrs. Jersey." "For the second time? Were you down before?" "I was," replied Miss Bull calmly. "I wondered who Mrs. Jersey had coming to see her, particularly after she had lost her courage when she saw the yellow holly in your coat." "You noticed that?" "Yes, and I noticed the holly also. I wondered why you wore it. The sight of it put into my mind that fatal night when he—" Miss Bull brushed aside her thoughts. "But no matter. I thought I would see if Mrs. Jersey was seeing anyone, and also I wished to talk about the yellow holly."
"But why should you trouble about her seeing anyone?"
Miss Bull looked down, and then looked up abruptly. "Mrs. Jersey would have sent me back to the asylum if she could, and I was always afraid lest she should see someone secretly about the matter. I crept down the stairs, leaving Marjory in my room playing at patience. Mrs. Jersey's door was closed. I heard the murmur of voices, and I put my ear to the keyhole. I heard that dancer. Afterward I learned that it was the dancer. I heard her accuse Mrs. Jersey of having killed Percy Vane."
"On what grounds did Lola base that accusation?"
"She said her mother told her."
"I remember," muttered George. The mother, on receiving back the stiletto, certainly might have thought so. "And what did Mrs. Jersey say?" he asked aloud.
"She denied it, and made some sort of excuse. I remained to hear no more. I knew then that Mrs. Jersey had killed my Percy."
"But she did not. It was an accident."
"I know. She explained. But she was the cause. I was right to kill her. But for her, Percy would have been alive. I would have been his wife. And you, George, would have been my stepson."
"What did you do next?"
"I went up to my room, and resumed my game of patience. I intended to have a talk with Mrs. Jersey the next morning, but when I found that she had struck Marjory, I came down at once."
"That was after 11?"
"About 1:15. Mrs. Jersey was in her room. We talked, and I told her what I had heard. She denied it. I pointed to the stiletto which was on the table as a proof that the girl had been here. Mrs. Jersey said that it was the same stiletto with which Percy had been killed, as Lola had received it from her mother. That put the thought into my head that God intended Mrs. Jersey should be slain with the same weapon with which my darling had been stabbed."
"A terrible thought. You should have put it away."
"I did, but it came again. I accused Mrs. Jersey of having killed Percy. She gloried in the fact that it was through her he had died. She declared that if Ireland had not held her hand she would have laid him dead at her feet. She exulted that the accident had fulfilled her intention, and taunted me with the fact that I never became his wife. I was very quiet," added Miss Bull, her eyes glittering, "but my blood was boiling. Mrs. Jersey turned her back on me with an insolent laugh, and sat down. The stiletto was on the table. Her head was turned away. I softly took the dagger and—" "No, no," cried Marjory, wailing. "You never did it. You never did it, dear Miss Bull. It was I who—" "Don't be a fool, child. I did it, and I would do it again." Miss Bull rose. "George, you now know all. Go. No, do not shake hands. I have avenged your father, and I expect I will be hanged." Marjory burst out into renewed weeping, and Miss Bull soothed her, talking to George the while. "Tell my sister," she said, "that the name of Howard will not be mentioned. I will die under my false name. No disgrace will be brought on her. As to Dorothy," here Miss Bull's eyes grew tender, "no disgrace will befall her. Marry her, George. Love her. Make her a good husband, and take this kiss to her from a sorely tried woman." Before the astonished George knew what she was about, he felt a pair of cold lips pressed to his own. The next moment she had pushed him out of the room, and had locked the door. That was the last George saw of her. Whether Marjory had agreed to die with her, or whether Miss Bull, knowing what a miserable life the girl would lead after her death, compelled her to take the poison, it will never be known. But when the door was burst open, the two women were found on the floor, in one another's arms. On the table was an empty glass, and it was ascertained that Miss Bull and Marjory had taken prussic acid. Bodsey entered the room an hour after the death, alarmed by the silence. He found that his prey had escaped. Miss Bull was buried under her false name, and Marjorie was buried with her. Nothing of Miss Bull's sad past or of her killing Mrs. Jersey came to light. She passed away with her only friend, and her story was told. 6 months later George Vane was seated in the library of the mansion in St. Giles Square. It was after dinner, and Lord Derrington occupied his usual chair. The old man looked brighter and happier than he had looked for many years. Daily George grew a greater favourite with him, and on the morrow George was to be married. Lord Derrington had insisted that as it was his last night as a bachelor George should dine alone with him, and would not admit even Walter. "It's the last time I'll have you all to myself, George," said the old man piteously. "After to-morrow Dorothy will possess you." "Not at all," replied George. "You will have us both. We will come back from the honeymoon in a month, and then we will live here." "That's all been arranged," said Derrington testily. "But we won't be two independent bachelors." "All the better," replied his grandson cheerily. "A lady in the house will make a lot of difference. You won't know this place when Dorothy is flitting about." "Don't. Her mother is the kind of woman who flits, and I won't have her doing the butterfly business in that way." "Oh, I don't think we'll be troubled much with Mrs. Ward. Since the shock inflicted by her sister's sad death, she has become religious." "Bah! That's only a phase." "Poor Miss Bull," said Derrington. "I like to think of her under that name. She had a sad life. I don't wonder she killed herself. Do you think she was mad, George?" "No, but I think the memory of her wrongs, which were all caused by Mrs. Jersey, was too much for her. She was mad for the moment, but she told me the terrible story in the calmest manner." "And who came in at the front door that night?" asked Derrington. "No one. After the murder Miss Bull opened it to fly, panic-struck, I expect, but Marjorie came downstairs and stopped her. Miss Bull closed the door, and remained to face the worst." "Well, she is dead and buried, and the scandal is laid at rest. Unless that Bodsey revives it." "Oh, you can trust Bodsey," said George, smiling. "He and Lola are quite happy, and she has almost forgotten me. I got a letter from Bodsey the other day. He is acting as his wife's agent, and they are making a lot of money." "All the better. He won't talk about that business. By the way, I forgot to ask you about Ireland's money." "The money he left me? I have settled that on Dorothy." "How suddenly he died," said George reflectively. "Just an hour after I left the house. I hope his end was peace. I think it was, as he felt relieved that you and I had forgiven him." "There was nothing to forgive. It was an accident, and if any blame is due it is to that Jersey woman." "Well, she is dead, and the woman who killed her is dead, so let them all rest in peace. But it was good of Ireland leaving me his money." "I don't see who else he had to leave it to. And 5,000 a year is not to be despised. Have you settled it all on Dorothy?" "Every penny. Don't you approve?" "Oh, yes, so long as Mrs. Ward doesn't get it." "She's a reformed character. Why, the other day she told me that she considered Dorothy irreligious." "Pah! New brooms! She'll soon grow weary of that pose. When the effect of poor Jenny Howard's death wears off, she will be as gay and silly as before. Don't have her in this house, that's all." "You can depend upon that, sir. But Dorothy will be here. Dorothy, whom I shall see to-morrow crowned with orange blossoms and—" Derrington laughed, but not unkindly. "Well, well. Better orange blossoms than yellow holly." George nodded. "I hope never to see yellow holly again," he said, and Derrington agreed. So their conversation ended on the threshold of George's new life, with that last reference to the old.
End of The Yellow Holly, by Fergus Hume. Recorded by Celine Major. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation as much as I've enjoyed presenting it to you.